Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Delighted to have you here. My name is John Hamry. I'm the president at CSIS. And when we have outside groups that come to meet with us before we begin, we always start with just a little safety announcement. I'm going to be responsible for everybody's safety today. So if we do hear an announcement over the loudspeaker, I'd ask you to follow my instructions. What we'll do is we'll go out these doors right behind me. This door is the one that's closest to the stairs that will take us down to the street level. We'll make two left-hand turns and a right turn, go over to National Geographic, and I'm going to give everybody a great show. You can go to the Titanic exhibit over there. It's a wonderful, interesting story because the Titanic, the discovery of the Titanic was actually a cover story for a secret Navy mission. We lost one of our submarines, and to locate it and to figure out what happened to it, we used the cover story that we were looking for the Titanic. And it's a fascinating little story. It's a great show. So I'll pay for your ticket if we have to go over there, but I don't think anything is going to happen. Anyway, thank you all for coming, and delighted to welcome back to Washington our friends from JETRO. I think you're celebrating 60th anniversary with JETRO, and this is quite an accomplishment. Done great things for Japan, and we've had a great partnership. I think for 13 years we've had this partnership with JETRO, and Ishige-san has been leading JETRO for, I guess, 7 years. I think you're one of probably the longest serving Director General for JETRO, and we've had a great opportunity to work closely with him these years. It's coming at this conference is coming at a pretty important time. I mean, talk about dynamic changes in the region. We've got new scratchy relations between us and China. I don't know if we're in the middle or the start of a trade war. It looks like we could be. We've got a president that's been pretty aggressive in pushing back on Japan on trade issues. So everything is just kind of, it feels just a little a little in flux. And we're going to have a chance to explore all of that together today with this conference, and I'm very glad that we have this opportunity. I do want to welcome Ishige Sensei for coming to be with us today. He's going to be our keynote speaker. He's a lawyer by training. He's been in the METI JETRO environment for, a long time. I think it was in 1974 is when you first got started in this business, and of course he's risen to the top. He's held numerous Director General positions within JETRO, and then was Vice Minister at METI before he went over to head up JETRO. And nobody is better positioned to help us today launch and frame the issues that are in front of us than Ishige-san. Would you please, with your warm applause, welcome Ishige-san to the podium, and let's get this conference going for real. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, it's 60 years since the establishment of our organization, JETRO. At that time, the E of JETRO means export. Now, E means external trade. External trade means not only export, but also import. And at the same time, investment investment activities are also promoted by JETRO. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for joining us today. I would also like to give my thanks to Dr. Hamre, Dr. Green, and Dr. Goodman, as well as their colleagues at CSIS for their continued dedicated work on this forum. As the head of JETRO, I'm pleased to be able to host this seminar on trade policy, which is one of the most politically sensitive and exciting issues in Washington these days. I'm small, so. Can you guess when this photo was taken? It might surprise you to learn that it was actually very recent, just a few weeks ago. In fact, on the occasion of the UN General Assembly in New York, President Trump and Prime Minister Abe still seem to have good chemistry. The two leaders released a joint statement on September 26. It affirmed the importance of a strong, stable, and mutually beneficial trade and economic relationship between the US and Japan. They also agreed to begin negotiations toward a US-Japan trade agreement on goods, or TAG. This may be an unfamiliar abbreviation, but in ASEAN or in Asia, it is used quite often. Don't worry, Minister Apiradi from Thailand knows this quite well, right? She doesn't agree with me. They also agreed to begin through this agreement, both countries aim to secure market access for trade in goods, including agricultural products and automobiles. It is intended to be mutually beneficial and respect the positions of both parties. The phrase, respect the positions of both parties, is quite politically important for both parties. I don't have to explain why. Someone in the panel after my speech will do so. I believe this communique will provide a good basis for negotiations. We should follow up on it at next year's seminar. I must thank President Trump and Prime Minister Abe for contributing to my job security in Washington. It also seems that President Trump's tarified trade policy, maybe terrified trade policy, would be a substantial business stimulus for Washington, D.C. We saw many trade policy experts here and there in newspapers, social media, and on TV. In the meantime, what will become of the relationship between the US and Asia, the theme of today's seminar? I would like to begin by speaking on 4 topics. 1, what has been happening in Asia? 2, what problems exist? 3, how would we like the United States to be involved? And 4, how should we respond? What should we do? The first topic is what is happening in Asia. Today in Asia, the digital economy is expanding. This can be seen in the rapid growth of the e-commerce market. Driven by innovation, numerous startups are beginning operations. Startups, innovation, and the digital economy are the 3 major engines for economic growth in this century. How many unicorns are there currently in the world? The US has 124 unicorns, by far the most in the world. But they have emerged in Asia as well. There are 76 unicorns in China, 11 in India, and 3 each in Indonesia and South Korea. They could become GAFA in the United States or BATJ in China in the future. One example is Gojek in Indonesia. Established in 2010, Gojek started out providing bike taxi and courier services using online applications. Since then, it has expanded into a multi-platform technology group engaged in fintech. This year, it has also begun investing overseas with the launch of ride-hailing services in Vietnam. This is an example of new phenomenon in Asia referred to as deep forking. New technologies are being introduced by skipping the conventional development steps. However, 2 conditions are required for these unicorns to do business. 1, securing a free and fair business environment. And 2, forming new rules to create this business environment. So the second topic is regarding new rules. How should we develop new rules? Big data is a source of competitiveness for companies in the digital field. Companies are vigorously developing technologies to cultivate and utilize big data. However, this requires securing free data flows and appropriate protection of information. And this means the formation of new rules. This has already been attempted in the TPP's chapter on e-commerce. It consists of cross-border transfer. It consists of 3 rules. A, freedom of cross-border transfer of information. B, prohibition of mandatory installation of servers. And C, prohibition of demand for source code disclosure. These 3 rules are also included in the new version of NAFTA, agreed upon last month. I shouldn't say NAFTA, I should say USMCA. However, even Vietnam, a TPP 11 member, has had difficulty implementing these rules. We must take quick action to form new rules to secure the free flow of data. How should we undertake this rule-making? I can think of 3 methods. 1, through mega FTAs like the TPP RCEP and Japan EU EPA and maybe USMCA. 2, through the WTO. And 3, through bilateral FTAs. Decision-making through the WTO requires much time. There are many members. Someone told me that there are conflicts of interest and fragmentations of interest and seemingly no shared interest within the WTO. But I don't think so. I would rather disagree with this observation completely. We should discuss this later. Decision-making through bilateral agreements can happen more quickly, but the cost is high, as many have to be made. Do you know how many bilateral FTAs are needed to play same role as the WTO? There are 164 members in the WTO. Between them, we would need an enormous number of bilateral agreements. Do you know how many? Please raise your hand if you have an answer. That guy. Please.
This is math, and it's not computation. This is combination. So we must calculate 164, choose 2. 164 times 163 divided by 2 equals maybe 30,366. This is my final answer. Right?
Correct. By the way, where are you from? Japan. Which organization are you from? So I have to raise his salary. He has a terrific mental calculation capability. Anyway, meanwhile, countries in Asia are attempting to form new rules within the framework of mega FTAs. The TPP-11 has been signed and is expected to expand. Thailand, Korea, Indonesia, Colombia, and even the UK are interested in joining the agreement. Negotiations for RCEP are underway, working toward a substantial conclusion by the end of 2018. In addition, a Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement was signed this July. All these mega FTAs are intended to be high-level agreements. Even in the case of RCEP, its members are seeking significantly high-level agreement. This is different from what it used to be before the TPP. Although the TPP is dead in the United States at this moment, it has gained influence in the other countries. E-commerce and data flows are certainly a big issue in those mega FTAs. The third topic is expectations of the United States in rulemaking within Asia. And here, there are two issues or concerns. The first is that the US is not involved in rulemaking for the Asia Pacific. If things continue as they are, rules will be formed in the absence of the US. Where the United States? It's difficult to find in Asia. The second is that the trade war and various trade disputes have impaired predictability and legal stability for companies. According to the IMF, the trade war between the US and China could drive down the 2019 real GDP growth rate of the US by 0.9% and China by 1.6%. These are big numbers in terms of economic growth rate. I would like to mention another survey by AmCham China and AmCham Shanghai. This was related to the impact US and Chinese types have had on US companies in China. About 70% of US companies in China answered that these types have adversely affected business. They are terrified and also terrified. And the shock waves of this trade war will spread beyond the shores of the US and China. Products made in China are often supplied by parts made in various other countries. Many of the suppliers overseas affiliates of US companies. The conflict will hinder trade with these countries and have an adverse impact on their economies through complex and intertwined supply chains crossing borders. The same is true for products made in the United States. Automobiles are a prime example. Many supplier countries will be affected here. We hope that the United States will de-escalate the current conflict and play a leading role in forming new rules for a global era. At the same time, I understand the concern shown by the US administration over trade distorting policies of third countries. They have seriously harmed Japanese and US companies. These include 1, technology transfer, 2, intellectual property protection, 3, subsidies to key industries, and 4, low interest loans through state-owned banks. As a country sharing common values with the US on free, fair, and open markets, Japan is prepared to work with the United States in solving these tough issues. With that, forming rules alone solve our problems? The answer is, of course, no. There remains another problem, protectionist sentiment. This is an issue that I also raised last year. The protectionist sentiment has been fueled by 2 factors in particular. 1, the impact of globalization on domestic jobs, and 2, the widening income gap. I fear that protectionism will not disappear until measures are enacted to help those left behind. Increasing the number of people who can enjoy the benefits of globalization may be one solution. I would like to call this measure inclusive trade-related policy. I believe that such a measure is necessary. Support for SMEs and entrepreneurs, cultivation and re-education of human resources. This is what I mean when I say inclusive trade-related policy. This is done through various forms of collaboration between local governments, educational institutes, and companies. I understand that the United States also has safeguards such as Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA. This helps workers who have lost jobs due to the impact of free trade agreements. Local educational institutes also work with companies to re-educate workers. It is my hope that inclusive trade-related policy will spread all over the world. Based on the topics I have just introduced, I would now like to raise the following questions to our panelists after my speech. 1, what will become of the US-China trade war? which has no end in sight. 2, what problems lies at its roots? Huge amount of trade deficit or deeper-rooted structural issues? 3, how can we solve this trade war? 4, can this be solved between the US and China alone? The US and others feel that state capitalism is distorting the market mechanism. This is a deeper-rooted problem that they face. If so, domestic structural reforms toward a free, fair, and open market are needed in third countries, including China. Even if socially or politically very sensitive, it must be pursued. The domestic reforms seem to be necessary and indispensable. This is actually what we learned in Japan through the economic dialogue between the US and Japan in 1990s. And as a result, we leveled the playing field so that foreign companies can do business with predictability and stability. I believe that Uruguay Round provided a great opportunity for Japan to implement the structural reform. Then, how can we solve this trade war? Would imposing additional tariffs each other help solve the problem? Continuous retaliatory measures or tarifying alone could lead to a solution? We all understand that the Trump administration likes imposing additional tariffs as a leverage for negotiations. However, I doubt that a tit-for-tat retaliation will lead to a solution. So the next question is whether this can be solved between the US and China alone. Of course, they have to try to find a solution by themselves. However, at some stage, a third country may have to intervene and play a bridging role between them. Maybe Japan can play this role in this game in the future. I say this because Japan shares common values, common responsibilities, and common interests with the US and the EU. Also, we have a long history of relations with our neighbor, and we share common interests and common responsibilities in Asia. I think Japan can play an important role in solving this trade war. In this context, the Japan, US, and EU trade ministers meeting, the trilateral trade ministers meeting, will be useful forum. I think that those 3 trade ministers should welcome China to one of their meetings at an appropriate time. It could be called a new Quad trade ministers meeting. And from there, new rules may be created. And the new rules should eventually become a multilateral agreement, namely the WTO. Needless to say, at this moment, we face the most difficult challenge that we have ever experienced since the establishment of the WTO. We can't stand here. Standing still means falling back. We have no choice but to develop solutions. In this globalized world, we are destined to be in the same boat. We must row together. We can't remain bystanders. Following this session, a panel discussion will be held with panelists from China, Thailand, the US, and Japan. I look forward to hearing what forecast they have on the trade war between the US and China, what is key to solving this trade war, what kind of framework should we build to engage in rule-making. In addition to those international framework issues, I also look forward to discussions about supporting those who are left behind, or what I mention as the inclusive trade-related policy. Overcoming prevailing protectionist sentiment is a very, very important issue, not only in Japan, in US, but also in the countries all over the world. How can we do that? Without solving this issue, we can't prevent trade wars from happening over and over again. Thank you very much.
So Ishige-san, thank you very much. As you have in the previous 6 CSIS-JETRO conferences you ran with us, you've given us extraordinary wisdom, insights, and perspectives we don't always hear in the noise and fury of Washington politics. And as always, you've given us a very hard homework assignment for the first panel, which I'll now moderate. We're going to have 2 panels and then a guest speaker today. I'll introduce the panelists today who come from across the region and from the US. We'll take a break, and then my colleague Matthew Goodman will moderate a panel of US experienced business leaders, Chamber of Commerce representatives, about how the US business community sees some of the issues we're discussing. And then at lunch, we'll hear more from Julie Chung, the Director of Japan Affairs at the State Department, who may be able to tell us something more about this new bilateral agreement and areas where the US and Japan are cooperating economically that perhaps don't come up in our panel. For today's first panel, we're going to look at developments in the trade architecture of the region. I'll introduce the panelists. We have clickers for you, which we'll practice with in a minute. So we'll hear briefly from each of the panelists. Then I'll ask Amy Seawright to give some comments. Then we have a series of multiple choice questions, and we'll ask you to use these clickers, and I'll explain how to use them in just a moment, asking your views about the different economic and trade negotiations underway in Asia, a bit of predictions, which we'll use to prompt a discussion from the panelists. But let me introduce the speakers in the order which they'll go to bat. First, Yasuhiko Ota is a Singapore-based editorial writer for Nikkei Shimbun. He covers the Asia-Pacific region and global issues, focusing on trade, investment, finance, and climate change. He has 30 years of experience in journalism in Asia, Europe, and in Washington, D.C. He's won numerous prizes, and he has hosted a very popular TV show, Zipang, which anyone who's lived in Japan or watches it on satellite will know, looking at economic developments across the region. Apiradai Tantraporn is to my immediate right. She's the former Minister of Commerce in Thailand, served in that role from 2015 to 2017. She had other key positions in that ministry and was the ambassador and permanent representative of Thailand to the WTO from 1999 to 2002. Professor Wong is a professor at the School of International Studies and director for the Center of International Political Economy at Beida at Peking University. He's been a consultant for the Asia Development Bank, the World Economic Forum, and other international economic agencies and organizations. And he's published widely on a range of topics in English, in Spanish, in Chinese, and I think in Japanese. Have I got them all? Yeah. And ancient Greek. No, not ancient Greek. But please keep your questions in English for today. And finally, Amy Seawright will comment on the presentations we hear. Amy's the Senior Advisor and Director for our Southeast Asia program here at CSIS. She served most recently as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia. She's worked in USAID, in State Department on APEC. Amy and I first met when she was a PhD student, and her academic career focused on Japan's trade ministry. And I think maybe there's an entire chapter in her dissertation on Ishige-san. We'll hear from the speakers, 7 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll turn to Amy, and then we'll come back to you all with the clickers. But don't turn your clickers on yet. Save the batteries for when we start that part of the program. So, Ota-san, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Yasura again. I'm based in Tokyo now, just got back from Singapore recently, and I don't really have the clear answer to the questions that Mr. Ishige placed, and wisely said, the 6th question, but instead I may have some suggestion or observation. I think it's worth sharing my views, how to look at from Japan or South Asia on the US-China issue. And I prepared some slides, so let me show. Oh, this is the first one. Okay, needless to say, we are living in the information age, And in agricultural age, so what is raw material is, of course, land. Everything come out from land. And industrial age, steel, maybe. And now data. But data, we can count the number of autos or steels, the volume, and we can measure the land scale, but we cannot capture the data, how it flows and where it goes and what is the contents of the data. So I was trying to visualize the data flow. That is this one. The submarine cables between the US and China and Asia, and I found, this shows how important the South China Sea is. The traffic of information go through the South China Sea. That's, I think, one of the reasons why the Chinese are quite keen in having the control on this region. And the information comes through the Singapore and come out from Singapore into the Indian Ocean and then eventually leads to the Europe. And on the other side, the Pacific and the US. And sometimes, US-China cable bypasses Tokyo nowadays. So that's the things happening. And information, what is the information? And who is the producer of data, which is the future asset, economic value, right? And data is produced by individuals, consumers, real living people in the daily life. So we have to look at how we can gather the information from the people in Asia. And in China, there's 1.4 billion people living, and in ASEAN, there's 600 billion people, totally 2 billion people. This is a mass production of data. So we cannot live without Amazon, right? And I use Amazon literally every day, and the delivery is coming. People comes to my house every day in the morning and the afternoon at night, precisely. And I seldom show up to the Sears anymore. So the information is gathered by Amazon, but it's not a case in Asia. Look at this picture. Amazon's territory is orange, and the blue one is Alibaba. It's a major power in Asia. It covers China and ASEAN as a whole. And there was the e-commerce company called Lazada in ASEAN, which was originally a German company, but it was recently merged by Alibaba. So it's all the data from the consumer comes up to the Alibaba server, right? So this is something we have to think about. Then I went to Shenzhen. Shenzhen is the big town nearby Hong Kong. Look at it. This is a bike share new service. You don't see the regular bikes anymore in this town. So all the bicycles you see on the street are the share bike, yellow, orange, and you can ride using the smartphone, and you don't need to pay by cash. It's so convenient. This is a new business model invented in China. I would call this a Chinese innovation. Instead, the other one I was impressed by in Shenzhen is, hold on, going to next. Cannot. Somebody help me. This is a place called the Electronic Town in Shenzhen. It's thousands of the brokers of electronic parts and more components sold by the inventors or engineers or creators. And all those come from the US, Silicon Valley, or Japan, Asia. Because this place is so exciting for the people who has an idea they want to use the technology in something new. And they come here and pick up the electronic part and then devices a new product. So innovation, of course, literally. They're tired, they're working hard, noisy. It's like a marketplace of digital creativity. So this is what's happening in China. And talking about the bike share economy, this is what is happening there in China. Because it's simply because it's China, it happens like this. Okay, millions of the bicycle was abundant, and it is like this, and eventually it comes like this. So this is China. And Chinese innovation, this is the nature of Chinese innovation. It says in Japanese letter, Chinese letter, it says a lot of births and a lot of deaths. So the birth and death rate is so high, Every 3 months, newcomers come to the market and compete heavily. And some lose their competition, some win. So it's survival game, so severe survival game. And I took a walk with my colleague over last weekend from White House to Capitol Hill. And what I found is here, it's a bike share in Washington. Isn't it too tidy? And obviously, the operational turnover is not so high. I think the bicycle stays in the station like this. So which is a better business model? I mean, so things are so dynamic in China. And innovation is taking place over there. And data, of course, from the bicycle as well, from cars and consumers, is accumulated into the server of the major data companies in China, such as Alibaba or Tencent. So we have to think about it. When it comes to the new framework of free trade, so the question is how to address the issue. We cannot just talk, while the Trump administration is obsessed with, busy with the steel, auto, and aluminum and agricultural products, the Chinese government is smart enough to look at the future value of the economy, which is namely data, okay? So we had a TPP. Now we don't have the US within the TPP. And the significance of TPP, I thought, when I covered the TPP a long time with Deborah, was not about the tariff, but it's a rule of digital economy, which is this basically stated the 3 principles: freedom of server location. Well, I use just a layman term. It's not really accurate in a legal way, but we can place your server wherever you want, so that you can keep your Amazon server within the US territory, so that still you can operate the service in Vietnam or Japan. And also you can transfer the data wherever you want, so there's a freedom, and also that you don't need to open your source code. This is something Britain. It's, I think, great invention by trade policymakers at the time. But when it comes to the new frameworks without the US in Asia, such as RCEP or other frameworks, free trade agreement in Asia, include China, what's going to happen if you automatically apply this principle into that new agreement? Then who's going to be the winner? China. China has Alibaba, for example, and Alibaba can do their business in Vietnam, still can say, okay, we keep that server in Beijing or Shenzhen, and still they can suck the information from Vietnam, so the data flows inside of the Great Wall. So this is what's happening. So it was a great achievement to invent such principles. This is very new. I think this is more important than tariff or the rule of origin, but we cannot simply apply to that, the new frameworks in China. So this is something we have to think about. Okay, so with that, I stop here. So later on, we should discuss more on that. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll definitely want to pick up the data reciprocity piece of the current architecture. Some of the agreements don't touch it at all, and some do. Minister Tantraport, please.
I thank you very much to follow up from what Ota has just said. First, Mr. Green, he told us last night that we have only 7 minutes, and if we exceed that, he has a secret button that he presses, and we drop in a water
Full
hole.
of sharks.
Yes, full of sharks. So I will keep my intervention brief. I think I have to go back from what the futuristic Ota has mentioned. I think from us, I come from the ASEAN, and I will say that the Asia-Pacific is an area full of economic integrations and cooperations. First, we start from ASEAN, which was born 51 years ago, and now we have reached the ASEAN FTA, or the free trade agreement among ASEAN. No more tariff, mostly are removed it. But the elimination of services or investment or certain non-tariff barrier is still work in progress. Barbara here, she has been working with us in ASEAN and in APEC. She knows very well the pace of work that the ASEAN is taking. So we are very slow, of course, but we have been able to reach a very stable agreement on the FTA. Then we build up the regional value chain through our ASEAN +1 dialogue with the China, with Japan, with Korea, with the Australia, New Zealand, and India. And finally, ASEAN proposed to wrap up all these dialogue partners into one big agreement that is the RCEP. Of course, last night I heard people kind of skepticism on will we be able to conclude this agreement with India, with China in the same agreement? It is tough. It is really difficult, but we had a final target now, next year, that it should be completed. Last weekend, the ministers of ASEAN and the RCEP partners had a discussion, and they were quite serious to say that, of course, this year we will only agree on principle of many, many areas, but next year we have to complete the agreement and substantial wrap up next year, especially maybe on rules and regulations that is behind the borders barriers, which is very important, even more important than tariff at the moment. So I think that once completed, RCEP will be the biggest FTA that we can see. We have the 28% of world trade within this grouping. After ASEAN, we have a broader agreement in APEC, which the FTAP or FTA-AP, the free trade in the Asia Pacific, which has a target in 2020. We start on a voluntary approach. I myself, as a WTO negotiator, I have a big doubt when we start the voluntary approach in FTAP. But today, I must agree, I see that this voluntary approach actually is working. The average tariff of the APEC members has reduced to 5.5%, and we are able to eliminate certain restriction in areas of trade in services, in area of trade facilitation. I like to bring up the importance of the US-Japan in Asia Pacific, in ASEAN at the moment, because it is crucial for the US and Japanese to be and to remain a strong partner for ASEAN and to become the pushing the energy in APEC, because I think that both have a strong value chain interest in ASEAN. The areas of interest between US and Japan is quite similar. You have automotive, you have electrical appliance industry, you have finance and insurance industry, telecom, digital economy, energy, just to name a few. But in this, there are big interests of US and Japan try to avoid the conflict or the eruption of trade war, the questions that Mr. Ichike has put in the beginning, what will become of the trade war that is looming, and what is the role of the other countries, including the Japanese role. We will see to that. So I think that what I have outlined, I think that I would like to emphasize on the complexity of the value chain, the interconnected world that we are living in, not mentioning if you're talking about the data of the Mr. Ota, the big data, then you can see that we are more integrated than we can see with our own eye. I would like to cite one example of how important is a value chain, and it is very important that we try to avoid any disruption of this value chain. In Thailand, we had the worst flood 4 years ago. That flood lasted 4 months, and it forced a closure of many manufacturers, including the computer chip, the hard disk drive producer, and the effect, just only for these 2 products, the effect is like tsunami. It spread to other continents in the US, in Japan, and in Europe. Auto industry Japanese industry can, Mr. Ishike can witness that, can confirm on that. They had to delay their production of the new model, the market, they cannot put the automotive, the new model in the market. Electronic consumer products, a lot has to stop their production, and computer, just to name a few. So these are the complexity of the value chain. I'm talking of only the incident in Thailand, a small developing country. So I think that we have to avoid that disruption. And so my final point, we are in this interconnected, very complex economic relations. And I think that in every relationship, sensitive as in trade, there is this hate and love relationship. So every now and then we fight, then we come to agreement and we fight again. We have witnessed many potential trade war in the past between Japan and the US and the EU, now US and China. Common denominator is the US. So I think that is, I would like to stop here now, and maybe later we can have further discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That was excellent. By the way, now that you're finished, I'll tell you, we don't actually have a button on the stage with a trapdoor that falls to a pool of sharks. That's only in John Hamre's office. Professor Wong?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I think first of all, I would like to express my deep thanks to the JETRO and the CSIS for the open this chance to me. See, I think that this conference is held in a very interesting, important, and timely way because, in my thinking, so when we talk about today's topic, economic integration of Asia and Asia Pacific, I think the core part is U.S. and China relations. Right? So that if we have the worst case scenario, the continuous confrontations of relationship, I think the whole picture of the region will be much darker than today. So I think that is why I highly appreciate this the chance. Secondly, I would like to emphasize, I speak on my own. I'm a scholar. I'm teaching at the Peking University. I have been the observer of this relationship for about 40 years. So I think I'm worried about this relationship, especially the changes of the mood in this country. Right? So in the country, I have, we have a lot of the connections, good friends. I have professors here. I have very good friends here. But we do worry about the directions of the relationship. In my view, a lot of changes in this country are driven by misperceptions and misunderstandings on the issue of trade and what is taking place in China. Yeah, so on the trade, I would like to say, I think generally speaking, the trade between the United States and China are balanced. Right, so I think that is you have a lot of smart people, the very smart, very clever economists, the traders, investors, right? So nobody want to do the business, of losing money, right? Because that is the basic base. The base of the trading relationship between the two countries in last several decades. So the one factor, I think, not very well understood by the public is the China's rising is the story of economic globalization. is the story of China's willingness to join the rising division of labor, especially the global supply chain. Okay, China is part of this global supply chain, right? China is at the still, I think, at the end, at the low end or the medium end, for the best. So China, the trade volume might be very large, but we have to think about, okay, that is a part of the global supply chain. I think the Apple, the iPhone, is the best example to show the distribution of the benefits of trade among the different trading partners, right? So 6%, the value added goes to the Apple itself for its branding and technology as to the investors in the United States. Chinese factories and workers earned about 5% of the value. Okay, they're only for the labor, for the hands. The other 25%, okay, goes to the manufacturers of parts and components, okay, in Japan, Germany, and others. Okay, that is stories. That is not that's the truth about today's trade. But the politicians, okay, don't want. First of all, they don't understand this complicated situation. Secondly, they don't want to let the public know it. So that is something I'm very worried about it. Okay. Another point about the trade and investment, right? I heard a lot of ideas, okay, from the media, from the business community in the United States, right? They complain about Chinese economy, Chinese market is closed, is getting closer, getting closer. Right. So I think that is perception is not shared by myself, right? So how can you call an economy like China, which has taken in about 25% of the Boeing planes? How can you tell, okay, China is a closed market? We've taken about 56% of the U.S. exported soybeans. Okay, how can you name China as a closed market? We're taking, taking about the 20% of the U.S. cars, right? So I think that is a very big question to us. So I think the media and politicians, and I think the politicians, right? They give. So I think, okay, they deliberate or not, okay, ignorance of the other data about the trade. Okay, one is in addition to the trade in goods. Okay, we have to calculate the trade in service according to different criterion. Right, China is in trade deficit in the trade in service. Right, it's about from 50 billion to the 90. Okay, to the $90 billion. Okay, that is mainly come from the China's tourists and the students that study in the United States, right? So according to the calculations of economists, the trade data, generally speaking, especially part of the U.S. trade deficit, has been exaggerated by 40 to 60%. And the more important, the U.S. investors in China, right, they have the sales in the Chinese markets as much as 500 billion a year. That means this company based in China, okay, will import a lot of components and parts, okay, the technologies from the U.S. So that is very important economic relations, but very unfortunately, I said, not understood well. All the such kind of professional knowledge about the trade hasn't yet very well disseminated to the public. It is, I think, the second category of misperceptions and misunderstandings about Chinese changing domestic, the political economy. Right. So we have, the media, especially the Western media, try to build an image of a changing China. Right? It comes to the more authoritarianism. Leaders concentrate more powers on that. So I think U.S.-China, in the last 20 years, has been a very good match to each other. In the first 20 years, U.S.-China moving in the same directions toward free trade, market economy. Yeah, that both sides they benefit from each other. China is rising as the second largest economy. U.S. keep the position of the largest economy. But interesting and very unfortunately, that both sides suffer the negative influence of the global economy. So that is the most important background for the transformations in China and in the United States in the last several years. China is moving in directions. U.S.-China has taken similar direction of changes to concentrate more on the domestic restructurings to get rid of the negative impact of economic globalization. That is why the Chinese government now, they're working more on the anti-corruptions, the poverty fightings. Right? Chinese government has set the target by the 2021. China will get rid of poverty. Okay, that is a big challenge. But the government set the target. In the past 5 years, the Chinese leaders emphasized 3 traps. I think it might be. I'm wondering, if you have heard it or not. But that is very important to China. That might be the key to development of a better, more accurate understandings of what is going on in China. Right. The first trap is so-called the President Xi. Okay, they talk a lot about the middle-income trap. China is at a crucial moment. China, is losing its competitiveness in productions of labor-intensive products. Now we see not only the foreign invested company moving off to China, Chinese company also moved from China, right? So because of the rising cost of labor, rising cost of land, okay, China have to spend more on the innovation to upgrade the industries. Okay, that is the background of 2025, manufacturing the projects. Right. The second trap is about so-called the city trap. The city trap named after some the ancient Greeks again. Right. So that means whatever the government says about your policy, or for bad or for good, but the people lost confidence. Okay, that is a very serious issue in China. The leaders address that in a very serious way to rebuild the government, to ensure the effective monitoring, surveillance of exercise of public power. So that is why we have, China has undertaken a very deep anti-corruption movement. The third one, the third one is that in the subsidy trap. On the other hand, it also be called the Kindleberg trap, okay, coined by Joseph Nye, the professor of Harvard. Right. So the Chinese discussion leaders. So when that means when Chinese rising, it's a big test for China and the U.S. Right? When the U.S. might be more willing to or not willing to take the burden of international responsibilities. The rising power like China is willing and able to take more international responsibilities, right? So that is a big thinking, about the China policy. So I think the answer is clear for China, for Chinese leaders, right? On this international obligation part, China goes to the Belt and Road Initiative and the AIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and other new initiatives. That is to provide the more international goods. China has become the second largest financial contributor to the United Nations. China sent in the largest numbers of peacekeeping forces in the world. Okay, I would like to stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll come back to a number of those points, especially BRI, and we'll ask the audience their assessment of BRI also. But before we do, Amy?
Yeah, thank you. I thought I would just make a couple of points, building on some of the points that have been made, but from a U.S. perspective of the emerging regional trade architecture. The first point is that, the United States in some ways remains the driver of regional trade dynamics, because with the increasing trade tensions between especially the United States and China and the escalatory tariffs, this has provided a lot of momentum towards the ratification and launching of the TPP-11, or the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I prefer TPP-11, so that's the terminology I'll use. Too many letters in the other acronym. Also, it's providing real momentum for conclusion, although not imminent conclusion, but for RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of 18 countries, there's much more political will to try to push those negotiations forward, even though they remain difficult. And I think there is much more progress being made on that front, that we will probably see some announcements coming out of Singapore and some more movement next year. And then we're also seeing a number of very interesting and some important bilateral trade agreements emerging, most notably the Japan-EU bilateral FTA, but Indonesia and Australia just signed an FTA, and I think we might see a raft of other FTAs in the future. And these are being driven, again, very much by real concern about the lack of U.S. leadership and participation in these in the regional trade architecture, and the escalating kind of tariff war between the United States and China, and the sense that countries have to move on and work together to provide other options and kind of hedging against what was in the past more settled certainties about trade dynamics. Having said that, the U.S. is, in a sense, a driver. It also is increasingly on the sidelines of trade discussions. And in particular, this is around the TPP-11, which, the TPP has always been all about writing the rules for trade. And of course, the United States was the major driver of TPP and helped write many of the rules. And in that sense, some American firms may benefit from some of the rules. But it's very important to note, with the United States no longer a member of TPP-11, the United States has lost a lot of leverage when it comes to discussing with countries, whether it's at the table for TPP-11 or at the table for with other partner countries on a variety of issues. The United States has lost a tremendous amount of leverage in trying to shape these very important rules. And there's so many rules that are being written right now, especially in Southeast Asia, rules on data and technology and e-commerce, which has been mentioned, rules on healthcare, areas that are extremely important for U.S. industry. And Southeast Asia is really emerging in many ways as the battleground between the United States and Chinese and other countries' technology firms, and it really puts U.S. firms at a disadvantage to really not have government officials at the table with the leverage that they once had. The second point to make on TPP-11 is that it is driving towards implementation of launching. 3 countries, Mexico, Japan, and Singapore, have already ratified TPP. Vietnam is expected to ratify TPP this month, and that will be 4 out of the 6 required ratifiers for TPP to launch after 60 days from the 6th country to ratify. And my expectation is that once Vietnam ratifies, there's going to be a bit of a race of the other countries to be in on the first, to be one of the original 6 ratifiers to get TPP launched. So New Zealand, Canada, Australia, Brunei, even Malaysia, I think might turn around rather quickly to try to ratify, which puts a timeline on TPP-11 to launch perhaps quite early next year. And so that will, once TPP 11 is launched, the CPTPP is in force, I think the conversation in the region is going to turn more and more intensely on what those dynamics mean for countries in the region. You already see countries like South Korea and Indonesia looking very seriously at whether they want to join TPP or not. Thailand as well, although Thailand may take a little longer given its political situation, but Thailand is looking at it as well. And interestingly, the UK is extremely eager to join TPP 11 once it launches, and there are some difficulties that they have to get through their Brexit, but that's also very much on the table. So I think what we're going to see next year is the launching of CPTPP and a really serious consideration of a number of countries in the region and beyond the region, like the UK, taking a serious look at joining, and that kind of competitive liberalization dynamic that was always a large part of the strategic logic behind TPP, that once launched, other countries will want to join, and they will have to join at these high level of very high quality rules will be in place. And once again, if the United States remains outside of CPTPP, it will be very much on the sidelines. And my final point is about RCEP. Of course, there are many questions about whether it can be launched anytime soon because the negotiations, especially between India and China, are very difficult. But there is some momentum. There is much more political will to try to move it forward. And I think it's very tempting to look at RCEP and be very dismissive about the commercial impact and the commercial and broader impact of RCEP, because it's so easy to compare it to TPP 11 and note the vast differences in the coverage and the quality of the rules. But I would point out just a couple of things. First of all, if and when RCEP launches, and I do expect that ASEAN will pull something together late next year or soon after, there's going to be one single rule of origin for 18 countries. That's one piece of paper that companies can use to do intra-regional trade of all of those 18 countries, ASEAN plus the 10 additional countries. The second thing to point out is, it's very much, currently it's very much a hub and spoke system where ASEAN has all these +1 deals with all of these other 8 countries in the region, and the logic of RCEP is to tie this kind of hub and spoke system, sort of tie it together into one bundle. When that happens, there's going to be some first ever free trade agreements among some pretty significant trading partners, notably Japan and South Korea, Japan and China, India and China. And so even if these are low quality, relatively low standard trade agreements, it's going to have an impact on regional trade. It may be a marginal impact, but given the scope of the trade, I think it's maybe a little more commercially significant than some people think. And then finally, the point to make that might be more obvious is strategically, symbolically, launching an RCEP is going to be really important. It's going to really give a sense that the region is on a path to economic integration, once again, without the United States present. And I think, and having India there, as well as China, Japan, all the ASEAN countries, is going to be very symbolically important for the region, and it's going to shape the thinking of businessmen and political leaders going forward.
Thank you, Amy. I think you did a great job capturing all the momentum that right now the U.S. is missing in many respects. I would add a slight note of optimism. I think you'd agree. First of all, the U.S. economy itself is a major magnet for investment from across the Asia-Pacific region. Japan's the #1 investor in the U.S. You talk to CEOs in Korea, Australia, and elsewhere, and they're talking about North America. So we're going to talk a lot about trade, but the FDI piece is a really important anchor. That buys us a little time, perhaps. And the second thing is, if you've seen the recent Pew polls, over 80% of Americans now favor trade and think trade is good, which is the highest number in the history of these polls. I'm sorry, that's Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll. Over 80% of Americans think trade is good. It's the highest ever in, I think, 30 or 40 years of these polls. In 2016, it was about 50%, I think. So there's a bit of learning going on, perhaps, in the public. And one could argue that the new trade agreement on goods between the U.S. and Japan is a case of learning by the administration in Washington of the consequences of staying outside of these agreements, because without getting the access and the agricultural piece of that, U.S. agricultural exporters, who are very, very important Republican voters in key districts in elections coming up, would have been pushed out of the market by the EU trade agreement with Japan, and especially by TPP-11. So Winston Churchill was reported to have said, you can count on the Americans to do all the wrong things before they eventually do the right thing. And Ishige-san's terrified is if you go to Iowa and other places, there's a little bit of terrified about all the terrifying. Ishige-san gave us some good questions. 4 of his 6 questions were about the US-China trade war. So I'd like to spend a few minutes with the panel exploring that before we turn to the audience to ask about these trade agreements and negotiations we've introduced in the panel. Professor Wong said that China's economy is not closed, and I suppose strictly speaking, it's not closed. It's people obviously invest and trade and work there. The trajectory in China's reform and opening, though, is not good from the perspective of a lot of business leaders and governments outside of China. The third plenum promised more reform and opening, but in general, I think if you read the reports of the American Chamber of Commerce or the EU or Japan Chamber of Commerce or JETRO, or pretty much any objective analysis, there are real concerns that that the reform and opening movement on the 40th anniversary of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening is moving in the wrong direction, is reversing, maybe for some good reasons, maybe because of fears of the huge amount of money China spent holding up the Shanghai stock market, the fear of moving towards a market-based exchange rate system and financial reform. I think some leaders probably got scared by that, but there's a very strong belief that the reform and opening trajectory is reversing and going in the wrong direction. I think that's part of what's happening, and we should keep an eye on that. On the other hand, there are signs that some inside the Trump administration really do believe that it's possible to decouple the U.S. and Chinese economy, which seems impossible given all that we heard from Minister Chandraporn and Ota-san and also Professor Wong about production networks, among other things. But the U.S., Canada-Mexico, USMCA, the new NAFTA in Article 32, says that any party can withdraw if another party does a free trade agreement with a developing country, which is clearly aimed at China. So the question I have for you is how do you see reform and opening in China? And do you think it's possible for the U.S. to decouple? It might be possible in certain areas. The map that Ota-san showed with Alibaba and Amazon almost carving up the world looks a little bit like decoupling. If you look at the U.S., Japan, EU trade minister statement that Ishige-san referenced, there's a clear and growing demand for data reciprocity on the side of the U.S., Japan, and the EU. So it's possible to imagine a world where maybe there's decoupling in certain IT sectors. 5G, for example, where the U.S., Japan, EU, Canada, and others say, we're not going to allow any entry into our market of government-owned telecommunication companies. Or you can see how the U.S., Australia, Canada, Japan, and other allies for security reasons are not allowing ZTE or Huawei. So maybe there's a partial decoupling that's coming in the future IT, or maybe it's just impossible. So let's try to answer Ishige's question by asking each panelist, how do you see the trends of reform and opening in China? And do you think that a decoupling strategy is possible or happening between the U.S. and China? Why don't we do the same order, Ota-san, and then we'll turn to you.
Well, I don't think it's possible. And also, there are needs in both sides, in the U.S. and China, that they want to be linked in a better way. But it doesn't seem that the Trump administration knows how to reach that target, how to address that need. And given the pressure on China, it doesn't work. From my sense is China is not a nation, or the Chinese people are not the people who bows under the heavier pressure. The more you give the pressure, they say no, no, no. So it's an endless game. So they have to have some kind of dialogue, and they have to address the real business. They have to listen to the business people's voice and what they really need. So that's one thing, and I think the misperception on China in the Trump administration is a matter.
Thank you. I think that I tend to agree to Ota-san. The approach you are taking against China is very important. And China sees themselves as a major power in the world, which is true. And the U.S. is another major power. So, but I think that the negotiators in both governments know real well how to handle each other. So I think that political showcase is one thing. Mr. Xi also has to show to his people in China how he handled the U.S. And President Trump also has to show to his constituency how he handled the Chinese. But I think that is something that we have assessed this very carefully. I see a lot of looming trade war in the past, and then both leaders tend to be able to maneuver themselves out of this trade war because it will hurt both sides. Whatever you do, whatever, it will hurt yourself. So this complex value chain that we have discussed is something that everybody has to have in the back of their mind in their dealing with each other. So decoupling, is it possible? I do not think. The more we move into the future of international trade, be it in the data or on the tangible products, assets, it is very difficult to detangle now, so to decouple now. So I think that we have to have a way to work together. But of course, China has to take serious consideration of this market situation in China. Since you have access to or be member of the WTO, the market situation in China is very important because you have such a tremendous effect on international trade. So when China moved, everybody felt the impact, the effect. So it's very important that China take this into account when you design your policy on international trade. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Wong?
Thanks. So about the issue of the directions of reform and open up in China, okay, I think that is a question debatable. There are a lot of the different ideas on it. Right? Washington has a lot of very good China hands on it. Right? So personally, I'm cautiously optimistic about what is going on in China. So I think there might be the useful way to describe what is going on in China as a process of rebalancing, readjustment, right? So I think the rebalancing. So I think that means a lot of people believe the old model of being fully integrated into the global economy, okay, might have some problem to China as a country like China. So that means that is, fully integrated means China have to give up. Okay, that is some sectors which are the high tech to develop the dependency on the sources of technology of the other countries. A lot of people believe that is also, have a deep implications of national security, right? So Mr. Ota, they mentioned the internet, security and data. Okay, that is something a lot of people in China think we have to address the concern, reduce the dependence of the international producers of the software, equipment, etc. But on the other hand, so I don't think the whole process, of course, of reform and opening up, will be turned around, right? So I think the trade war between the U.S. and China to some extent is good, right? And it's to stimulate the process of reform. A lot of people in China, as in even some people in the leadership, taken the trade frictions as the catalyst to break the constraints of the vested interests, push forward the reform and opening up. So as the leaders said itself, now the China reforms is end the period of deep water. That means over the last 2 decades, a lot of invested narrow interests has been formulated. They feel very comfortable about not opening up further to international competition, right? So the leaders now, I think that might be good, right? To take in more international obligations is a good opportunities to open up the Chinese economy. So I think in the context of the trade frictions, Chinese door has been opened further, right? So in July, Chinese government announced that lowering tariff on the pharmaceutical, on the imports, automobiles, very substantially. China has, has opened the market, the 100% ownership to international financial institutions.
Professor Wong, can I ask you? So Ota-san made a very interesting point, which is in China, if you hit it with a hard, you don't get a good result. And but you suggested that maybe the tariff war will stimulate reform. I worry that the tariff war or the U.S. position on Huawei or ZTE, which I think has legitimate national security purposes, that all of that is going to encourage rent-seeking in China. It's going to encourage mercantilism. It's going to encourage more of a government sector. Wouldn't it have been better if TPP had moved forward with the U.S., and then TTIP with Europe, and then a new NAFTA, and then invite China into a bit? Wouldn't that have been a better way to encourage reform than tariffs, in your view?
Yes, I think that is. I think that is just reported, right? So you have noted that China Japan have warmed up its relationship. I also think Mr. Abe will be visiting China very soon, about October next week. Yeah, I think Japan. I would like to echo the point raised by Mr. Ishika. That is, Japan has a large role to play in this process as a part of the whole economy of the region. Right, so I think that is very deeply integrated. Right? Japan, I think, is expected to play some role like a coordinator between the two, because Japan has the deepest stakes in the relationship between the two. Yeah, so I think the good news that China Japan permits to work together on third country markets, for example, in talent. I think very good news to the two countries, very good news to the region. Right, about the part of CPTPP, that is just reported. China might be very interested in joining the CPTPP as the part of the measures, to deal with looming the fundamental trade war with the U.S. I think that is might be again. This region, it comes to the cause of the competitive liberalizations, right? I think that is good. So as you know that the leadership of China is not is quite familiar with Okay, that is influence of CPTPP. Okay, at the beginning of the last 5 years, right, especially in the in 2013 and 2014, we had very intense discussions about China's possibility of joining CPTPP. If China can do so, I think they're very good.
Well, I mean, if China agrees to the data access provisions in CPTPP, U.S.-China trade friction would probably go down. So that's a good future. Let me ask, I'm going to be like, I was leading the witness before, but I'm going to just end this section by doing a John McLaughlin, predictions. Amy, you're going to go first. Stand by. So how long will this current U.S.-China trade war last? 6 months, 6 years, 6 minutes?
Well, I don't see many off-ramps, so I do think it's going to last a while. I think a lot may depend on how long President Trump's in office. But yes, I definitely think past 6 months. So
Okay.
I'll say a year and a half.
Professor Wong, how long?
How long? I think now we have two countries have very strong leaders with very strong personality. I think both of them speak a lot. So I think they will meet, I hope, at the G20. November 30. November 30. So I think if they meet and have a good relationship with each other to continue, I think at least we can have some truth at the G20. But but I think you will leave the time for two parties to negotiate a real win-win deal. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Okay. All right. Oto-san.
Well, G20?
G20?
I don't think so. I think it takes more time. But I think my sense is that China has more flexibility. And you don't agree with me?
More flexibility. I'm sorry. More flexibility meaning
in terms
they
of
can make more concessions? Is that what you mean?
Not a concession, but
more options.
Yeah, more options, I think. Yeah. So, like he said, they're even joining the TPP-11 probably. But I don't have much. I can say that I don't have much expectation on Abe's role. I think. Even though Mr. Abe is going to Beijing, I don't expect too much outcome of it. But yeah, it's a wait and see.
Thank you. I don't know if we are already in the war or not, but I think that, as I said earlier, the two sides seem, in previous case with the U.S. with other countries, you seem to be able to maneuver out of the war. So I hope, I'm optimistic. So I hope that they will have continue discussion, dialogues, and of course, once in a while they will hit each other, but then they will change their role and, you take turn hitting each other, but I do not think that we will plunge into the real war.
Count Amy most pessimistic. We're going to ask you all to answer questions now. So on your table are these clickers. The orange button is the power button. So push that until the green light goes on. Everybody good? If you have a problem, raise your hand and one of our technical staff will rush to your assistance. If you have a problem, just raise your hand and we'll help you out. So we'll put up questions. And you choose multiple choice, A, B, C, D, E. And we're going to try to unpack progress and content of some of the alphabet soup of trade agreements we've been talking about. So could you put up the first slide, Yuka? Yeah, we can vote too. Matthew Goodman wants me to lead you to believe it's anonymous. No, it's anonymous. We're not so, our AI surveillance is not so sophisticated at CSIS. We don't know who is voting what. We'll just see the aggregate. So the question is, which initiative has the greatest momentum now? Okay, so CPTPP. We have Canada to thank for adding CP to TPP, I understand. We can all say it. CPTPP has strong momentum with RCEP and Belt and Road far below. So that's interesting. So people see more momentum to TPP-11 than to a Belt and Road. Could I have the panel comment? Amy, you want to start us off?
I sort of talked about it a little bit in my comments already, the ratification process is going forward. I think once it launches, there'll be a lot of countries on the outside looking at the investment that's going to be flowing into countries like Vietnam and Malaysia if Malaysia ratifies. So countries in Southeast Asia are going to be looking jealously at their neighbors, which is why President Jokowi keeps telling his cabinet that he wants them to look seriously at joining CPTPP. Again, I don't think that's imminent, but I think there's going to be a dynamic of countries in the region looking carefully at the agreement and the impact, and that's going to set up a dynamic of other countries really kind of wanting to get in. RCEP is difficult. It's you know they've been through 24 or 25 rounds by now and haven't been able to seal the deal in time for the Singapore summit. So it doesn't look, you know, even though I think there is an injection of political will behind it, I think it's still going to take a while to really kind of get it over the finish line. And Belt and Road Initiative is huge in ambition and an incredibly successful kind of marketing project of China to put a lot of its infrastructure projects under this label with a very bold, ambitious vision, a lot of dollar signs behind it. But I think there's a little more skepticism about BRI in the region right now. There are a lot of countries, most notably Malaysia, are taking a second look at BRI projects, but others, Indonesia and others as well, are facing some bumps there. So there's a little bit of caution and a little bit of there's certainly momentum under Belt and Road, but I think it's some of the shininess has lost a little bit of its luster right now.
Professor Wong, if we did this survey in China, would the result be Belt and Road is number one?
Not really. First of all, I think a lot of people will say, okay, all these things are good, all are good program. And the best word to describe the relationship among these different programs is complementary. Okay, such a kind of approach, reflect the way of thinking. I think that is some philosophical things. China, I think the typical Chinese way of thinking is not it's a strategic competition, right? It's not a zero-sum game. Okay, all this good. I think that is China's official positions. All this good. TPP is good. Okay, when the country in the region are ready to go, okay, let them join. Because there are very big gap in terms of development among the countries, right? So we should have the different solutions to them.
That's a really good point. We're portraying this like a horse race. But under competitive trade liberalization theory, if they're all moving, then everyone gets richer. And even when you're talking about trade agreements vis-a-vis Belt and Road, which is not a trade agreement, of course, it's an infrastructure project.
Yes.
But you think it affects?
Definitely. I think that is infrastructure oriented. Okay, the Belt Road Initiative. So I think that is deep thinking about the roles and implications of the Belt Road Initiative, right? So that for these underdeveloped economies, what they need is not, okay, I think it's infrastructures. It's better needed by the economy to living standard, to prepare for a better investment climate, right? So I think that is, them thinking. Okay, they're buried in the Belt Initiative. China want to help to meet the interests of China have money, and these countries have the chance to develop. That is, both sides can work on the infrastructures. So I think all the people of the country, including the United States, will benefit from it.
Thank you, Ota-san. Yeah.
Oh, I voted the Belt and Road Initiative, yes, because based in Singapore, I have observed that the climate in Southeast Asia, and I don't see any enthusiasm on the TPP-11 or RCEP at all. I mean, instead, when Xi Jinping did not invite Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong last year to the Belt and Road Summit in Beijing, the Prime Minister Lee looked so perplexed. And since then, they became really quiet on South China Sea. And because this is Belt and Road initiatives often regarded as the infrastructure building initiative and also the tools to wield the power as a hegemon by China. But it is a trade policy from my point of view. It is industrial policy. And it's only initiative which address real business. So the people in Singapore, the other nations in the ASEAN, want to have business. So, but the CPTPP or RCEP is more like conceptual. It's a policy. I mean, it's framework. So I think that the BRI comes to at least the tomorrow's business. So that's why Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong cannot really ignore the voice from the business sector. So that's why I said there's a momentum.
How did you vote?
I vote for Belt and Road also because the question is, which of these initiatives has a great momentum? And the great momentum to the business at the moment is the BRI because of the infrastructure projects. Thailand took initiatives already to set up their economic corridor to support these initiatives. The infrastructure, we have the third international airport underway, we have the high-speed train, and the web of the highways, to support this project. Because I think that this Belt and Road initiative is something that will support the economic integration in ASEAN, in the ASEAN Economic Community, where we have the FTAs, we have the FTA with China, and this Belt and Road initiative is something that we will go right through to the southern part of China, which is the landlocked part of China. Their transportation or logistic costs from this area of China to the coastal area is very expensive, much more expensive than their access to the sea through Myanmar, through Thailand, through Cambodia. So this Belt and Road initiative will have the short-term impact on the economies of the region. I think that the economy of Thailand has picked up lately because of the construction or infrastructure construction related to this BRI. So I think that the short-term impact will be the BRI. The other agreements, you need to see the implementation aside from the ratification. RCEP still in negotiations, although we have the very determined target for next year to complete, then it still takes time for the impact to be felt. So I think that the short term will be the BRI. Thank you.
That is a perfect segue to the next question we're going to ask, which is in 10 years, which of these initiatives or trade agreements do you think will have the most impact or most define Asian economic integration? Nobody voted for ASEAN Economic, AEC is ASEAN Economic Community. Yeah.
It's already done.
Okay, so interesting. So BRI did a little bit better, but maybe it's because you had several panelists talk about its importance. So I'm not sure whether, yeah. This is why when pollsters do surveys, they randomly change the order of the questions. Let's go to the next question, which will unpack BRI. And the next one, there we go. So how, can everyone see that? How do you define the Belt and Road Initiative in your view? A is it's creating a new Sino-centric economic architecture that will transform Asia's security. B, competing head-to-head with Trans-Pacific economic framework. C, mainly a waste of Chinese money on ill-considered projects. Wow. And D, likely to pave the way for economic development and an open rules-based integration in the Indo-Pacific. So there's a 70, it's shrinking, it's growing. It's 74%, 75%. All right, we'll just stop it. You can freeze it, Yuka. 73% view that that Belt and Road is creating a new Sino-centric economic architecture that will transform Asia's security dynamics. Let me start with you, Amy. Is that your view?
Well, I would have chosen none of the above if that was offered. I think these are a little extreme, but if forced to choose, I think I'd go with A. Again, I think it's a little overstated because, and in that sense, to some degree, you might consider B as an option. But in other words, it's certainly the motivation. In my view, it's certainly the vision of China that Belt and Road will be a central vehicle that will create a Sino-centric economic architecture, and that will have a real impact on China's role in the region and security dynamics in the region as well. So I do think China sees it in a somewhat competitive lens, but whether it will have that effect in 10 years, I'm skeptical. I think we can put too much weight on BRI, actually, because I do think there's a growing skepticism and consideration in the region about being careful about picking particular projects. And, as you said, Mike, the United States and other countries are not exactly out of the picture. I continue to hope, as you do, Mike, that based on current opinion polls and other things, other dynamics, that the United States will find its way back to CPTPP within 10 years. And Japan and Australia and India and other countries are engaging in various frameworks and stepping up. So I don't think it's a done deal that China will succeed in its vision within 10 years. So I'll stop there.
Other views on this result? I would say the answer is all of the above, myself. There are definitely changing dynamics in terms of security. The port at Hanbon-Tota or Gwadar in Pakistan, Chakpao in Myanmar, these have security implications. They're dual-use facilities. They change the dependence, potentially, of countries like Laos, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, potentially, the Maldives. Elections have changed that, but the debt traps and so forth could create the kind of security dependence that that leads to a real competition in the Indo-Pacific. What pejoratively is called by some neocolonialism, but certainly questions about what kind of access and influence and even coercive options it gives Beijing if the region becomes increasingly competitive. B, yes, it is competing head-to-head with the Trans-Pacific Economic Framework. As we heard from Professor Wong, that's not necessarily a bad thing, though, because the more dynamic the Trans-Pacific trade architecture, the more inducement or pressure for Belt and Road to comply with rules. Is it a waste of Chinese money? Yes. It's non-transparent. The accountability is minimal. Is it going to pave the way for economic development based on an open rules-based integration? Maybe. I mean, if the U.S., Japan, and other countries put forward money, the BUILD Act, which is moving through the Congress, where the U.S. will put more money down for OPIC-like guarantees. JBIC is putting more down. If more countries are throwing dollars in infrastructure, then there will potentially be more inducement to cooperate. But also, I personally suspect at some point Beijing's going to discover the moral hazard and the downside of so many less developed countries owing money. And when Japan, somewhat different situation, but if you all remember in 1997-98 when our friend Sakakibara-san proposed the Asia Monetary Fund to sort of compete with the International Monetary Fund, the Japanese Finance Ministry backed away pretty quickly when they realized how bad the politics were of lending money around Asia without the IMF, without the U.S. The moral hazard problem, I think, could potentially incentivize China to try to collaborate more with the World Bank, more with Japan and even the U.S. In some ways, you could argue that's happening with AIIB. So they're all right. And a lot of it will depend on what the U.S. does, perhaps. So that's the next question. if you could, Yuko, which is what's the most likely impact of Trump administration trade policy in Asia? Wow. Anybody disagree with that outcome on the panel? I would personally give D a little, I'd give him a little more credit than 4 or 5%. You know, often trade agreements begin with protectionism or friction, and so this is not necessarily the last chapter we're in right now. One more, and then we'll open it to the audience, and that is, which of the following economic initiatives should the U.S. and Japan together prioritize in the next 2 to 3 years? Can you put that up, Hugo? Getting the United States into CPTPP, negotiating bilateral trade agreement. This is the next 2 to 3 years, so it's the Trump administration. Addressing bilateral economic irritants sector by sector, or D, working together on economic cooperation in third countries. So given President Trump's pretty categorical rejection of TPP, I assume people in category A are thinking more in terms of a trajectory or a path towards TPP 11, 12, U.S. participation somewhere down the road. Amy, does that look realistic to you?
You mean in terms of the A winning? Well, yeah, I guess I'm pretty pessimistic that there's much that Japan can do with U.S. counterparts to change the thinking of the Trump administration on TPP, CPTPP. So, so given the time frame, I do think that's a little unrealistic. Yeah.
Ota-san, what do you think?
I think it's as long as the TPP or TPP 11, the name matters. I mean, I don't think the Trump administration can jump into the existing regime. So there's just discussions going on in the Japanese government that they have two options: to have the totally new frameworks, which similar to TPP, but with a different name and different style. And the effect, economic effect, the impact is the same as the TPPs. So this is one thing they might pursue. That is maybe the option that the U.S. can consider.
I wonder if maybe after hearing Ishige-san's excellent presentation, also Ota-san's focus on data reciprocity, whether there's an E, which is the U.S. and Japan should really focus on this problem of data reciprocity. It's largely a problem with China. It's in TPP, was in TPP, is in TPP 11. Maybe that's an area. It's not included, or is it, Matt, in the, we'll find out maybe from Julie, in the new bilateral? So it's not in the new trade agreement in goods, right? It's included in NAFTA. So maybe the E would be the U.S. and Japan should break out that piece on data reciprocity that we've heard about already several times this morning with EU, Canada, and others perhaps, but make it a higher priority. All right, I'm going to open it up for some questions from the audience. We have microphones, and we have about 10 minutes for your questions. Let's start right here. Yep.
My name is Hayato Tanaka from the JBIC, Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Thank you for your interesting insight. It was very interesting from different perspectives. My question is similar to one of the questions on the slide. It's about the article included in the recently agreed USMCA, which discourages or undermines potential trade agreements with non-market economies, presumably China, if I may. which can be a model to other trade agreements that involves U.S., including the U.S.-Japan TGA. So some say that this article or U.S. conduct would enhance, paradoxically, the agreements of in East Asia, including RCEP. And some say they question or they doubt that it can be achieved in such a short of time. So my question is, what would be the impact of the USAMCA's particular article or other conducts of the U.S. Current Trump administration to the on the economic integration in Asia? It can be to any of you.
Does anybody want to address specifically the new NAFTA USMCA Article 32 that says that any party can withdraw? It's not automatic, but it's a strong statement.
I thought he was asking about a different article, but I'm not following.
Yeah. It's the same one, non-market, but it's clearly with China in mind. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine, for example, if TPP 11 is ratified, as you said, Amy, in the coming year, and the U.S. doesn't get around to negotiating for years down the road, what do we do? Insist that Japan and Australia and all the other countries pull out of the free trade agreements they have with market economies? I don't see how practically we could do it. It strikes me as more symbolic than binding, but I don't know if others have a different view. Is there concern in China? Have you heard about this, Professor Wong?
Yeah, I think that this is a question, which has attracted attention in China, right? Okay, some people are skeptical that after the U.S. wrapping up all these talks, okay, the main target will be China. Yeah, I think this is special clause. Or some people call it the poison pill, right? Yeah, I think first of all, it's very hard to define. Okay, what is market economy, right? I think the U.S. might define its economy. You have laws to rule that, but I think the world is complicated. Yeah, so your trading partners has very complicated, the domestic institutions, right? So I think if you pursue this, you will have a lot of problem with your trading partners, right? Secondly, I think that is about sovereignty. That is to the limit. Okay, the choices of policies of your trading partners. So I think that is in terms of domestic politics, okay, to a lot of countries. Yeah, I think that is a problem. Okay, that is so I think that is a third point. Is that okay? China's positions. So on this, I think that is China's feel some pressure from this, right? So the China, we might say the more efforts on the Chinese side, okay, to go for the free trade agreements. Okay, that is some test. Okay, that is also something to give some eagerness to the Chinese party, okay, to negotiate more, so the FTAs. But I'm not sure. Yeah. But I think the question that maybe to you and to our colleagues here, right? So I think okay, what's the source of this idea? On the special clause included. What kind of thinking there? So I think that is very, very different from what we have had before, with this government.
We are meeting, within days or weeks of Vice President Pence's speech on China, the USMCA, with this clause about no deals, or you can pull out if you want to, if one of the parties does a deal with a developing country. I mean, these are all kind of new. Even the Pence speech is new in the way that it linked across security, economics, and different issues. So we're meeting at a time when it's not clear how much of this is durable or not. And that would apply as well here. My own personal guess is it's more symbolic than anything, but we'll see. Another question. Yes, sir, right there. I think, Jesse, that's okay.
Thank you. My name is Song Zhang. I'm a journalist with Shanghai Wenhui Daily. It seems to me Trump administration officials keep talking about this so-called poison pill in the NAFTA second. So how do you panelists look at this issue? Well, Japan, European countries, and others will take into consideration when they talk the FTA agreement with United States. Thank you.
Do you think this would be a problem, Ota-san, in the U.S.-Japan talks that are now starting if the U.S. insisted on a similar agreement? Of course, the Japanese side calls this a trade agreement in goods, so maybe it doesn't count as an FTA.
Well, my sense is there was a heavy discussion within the Japanese government for the last 2 or 3 months. That is that they have two options, basically, when they decide to start a new negotiation framework with the U.S. bilaterally, how to define the nature of this framework. And they eventually came to the answer was shown in the name of this agreement. This is a TAG, Trade Agreement of Goods. So it narrows the scope of the agreement. So if they want to have the top-notch agreement with the U.S. bilaterally, they might include the digital and data and everything in it, but they didn't do it. So which is different from new NAFTA, for example. NAFTA included all the digital stuff. So just wondering if, my guess is Japan's strategy is to narrow these TAG things as narrow as possible and finish it up as soon as possible, whatever the outcome might be, which might comfort the Trump administration. And instead, parallelly, they might discuss new frameworks multilaterally, as I mentioned before. So I don't know. So that is my thought at this moment.
So it may not rise up in the U.S.-Japan context just yet.
Yeah.
One more question, and then we'll wrap up. Over on this side.
Hello, I'm Takunemoto. I'm a Japanese international trade lawyer, originally from Nishimura Asahi, which is a Japanese law firm, and currently working with the Cohen Group, a consulting firm in DC. I have a question on TPP issues, and I'm very happy to hear from Professor Wong that China is interested in joining the TPP. But there's a still gap between TPP's digital rule and China's policy on data. So how Japan and other countries should deal with this gap? And from other perspective, on one root of the trade war between the U.S. and China is WTO's ineffectiveness in dealing with China's SOEs. And then the TPP, to address this issue, TPP create the SOE chapter. So what could be the strategy for Japan to involve China into TPP-type rules? This is maybe a question for Mr. Ota and Ms. Seawright. And for Professor Wong, I would like to ask, what could be obstacles for China to join the TPP? Would China really are ready to join the TPP, or the China still want to maintain its digital policies and SOE policies? Thank you.
Okay, so how
That a difficult question, I think. Well, how Japan can convince the U.S. to come back to
China?
China.
Much easier.
Probably. Well, my sense is that China is a nation. It's a high pride nation, so that they need to have the process to keep the face of China, and cannot. Well, my observation from Singapore for the last 3-4 years is the Belt and Road Initiative was fostered by TPP, and you do remember 2 years ago we had a discussion here. It was just the beginning of the idea of Belt and Road Initiative that it's developed, year by year, under the pressure of TPP, so that China is more flexible than we think. We tend to think that so it's still developing. So it is a room in China that for some reason, somewhat they might include the idea of to evolve into the new concept of the architecture. So I don't think we can directly let them join to the TPP, but there's the room in our side that so we can prepare some frameworks that China is easily jumping into this. So.
And Professor Wong, what would it take to lure China, induce China, pressure China to do TPP 11 or 12, 13, whatever?
Yes, I think that is an interesting question. Thank you. Yeah. I think first of all, I think the more people in China, once again, tend to believe the new issues addressed by TPP or currently CPTPP, right, is inevitable, right? So you want to, make deal, to continue the trading relationship with all the major partners, right? You have to respond to these new issues, right? On the other hand, the Chinese industries and Chinese companies has become much more confident about their positions on the new issues, right? So I think from the floor, our panelists discuss about the role of Alibaba, right, of Taobao, or the other. So in the internet, the companies, right? So among the top 10, so in the world, is 4 are based in China. It's not limited to Alibaba, the Tencent, right? The Baidu and the other one, right? So that is industries also build pressures on the government to make the new rules, right? To make Chinese current rules more compatible with the rising of the news included in the the CPTPP. Right. So another things on the SOE, the state-owned enterprises, that might be some concern. That might be the most difficult part. If China is engaged in the talk about the membership of the TPP, that is one. But I think that, as I already stated, right, so that is a good chance for China to push forward the reform and opening up. So I think that is now it might be the government to examine the issues of the SOEs from more political perspective, because it's related to the political power of the party, of the government. But now I think after this, I think it will be more market-oriented perspective. We'll apply, we're dominant. So I think that is CPTPP can help.
Amy?
I think on the question of how to induce China to TPP, the people on the next panel are much more qualified than me to comment on that, so I think I'll pass.
So we heard from Professor Wong that if we are collectively going to move back on the path of what we once knew and perhaps still know as FTAP, Free Trade of the Asia Pacific, it's going to take the private sector in China, especially the internet giants like Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu. And that's why the next panel will be helpful in providing insights. As the security guy on the panel, I would just ruin your party by pointing out that it is precisely that control of data and control of the internet that the party under Xi Jinping is counting on to intensify its control over every aspect of Chinese society. And so you'll have a real clash of the private sector interests and the national security surveillance state and frankly much more powerful interests. But that's why all of these different agreements matter, because it starts to change the balance of influence within countries as well and can have an impact. So we're going to take a coffee break, but first please join me in thanking our terrific panel for this discussion.
Well, welcome back. Hope everybody got a little refreshment and conversation. So my name is Matthew Goodman. I hold the Simon Chair in Political Economy here at CSIS, and political economy means whatever I want it to mean. So I focus mainly on this topic, Asian economic integration. That's kind of if you had to sum up what we do in the Simon Chair, it's largely centers around that. Delighted to be working with Mike Green again for whatever this is, the 5th or 6th time we've done this together, maybe more. CSIS has done this 10, 12 more times since even before Mike was here. And we love working with JETRO. We appreciate their support generally for CSIS and for this event in particular, which is always a highlight of the year. So delighted to have you all back. We're here as the panel that is going to give you a U.S. business perspective on these issues of Asian economic integration and the U.S. and Japanese roles in such. We are handicapped in 2 regards at least. One is that we don't have toys. I mean, we have these toys, I guess, still here, but we don't have clicker questions. So we're going to have to, you're going to have to rely on we're going to have to rely on your smarts in our panels as well. The other problem is that there was a lot of good points made in the previous panel that have sparked new thoughts and questions, and I don't think we're going to be able to get through everything, so forgive us, and when we get to the Q&A session, if we didn't cover something, feel free to ask about that, but I know there's a lot to cover here. The good news is that I have a fantastic panel up here, and it's one of these panels where you just put in a quarter and you get, a prize. You don't have to work very hard as the moderator, so I'm going to let them do most of the talking here. Going down the line, these are all old friends and colleagues of mine, but in case you don't know them, I'll introduce them. To my immediate right, your left, is Kristen Silverberg, who is Managing Director. I'm sorry, I've skipped. I'm not looking. Sorry. Barbara Wiesel, to my immediate right, is the Managing Director at Rock Creek Global Advisors. She was, as many of you know, the Assistant USTR for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and she was the Chief Negotiator of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we have talked about a lot and will continue to. For many years, she was at USTR and worked on other parts of the region as well prior to that, including Japan, which I had forgotten. So that's great. You're perfect for this role. Okay, then next to Barbara, going down the line, is Kristen Silverberg, who I again know well from previous lives, Managing Director at the Institute of International Finance here in Washington, which again is a terrific outfit that I think many of you know Tim Adams, who is the CEO and an old friend of a lot of ours. Kristen's participation gives us a chance to do something that we don't do enough in this event, which is to focus on the financial dimensions of the Asian economic integration story. Kristen was U.S. Ambassador to the European Union in 2008-09. She was also Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs, and was Deputy Assistant to the President and Advisor to the Chief of Staff when Mike and I were at the White House. So we are delighted to have you with us, Kristen. And at the far end is Charles Freeman, again an old friend from our time in the EOP together. Charles is Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He was Assistant USTR for China Affairs in the Bush administration. He's also worked for a number of, law firms, consulting firms, and household name companies as well. And he also, I think, spent a little time at a think tank, this one here, CSIS. He was in our Freeman Chair, no relation, but for many years in China studies. Terrific to have Charles with us. Okay, so this is a great group. We're going to do business. So let me start with you, Charles, as the representative of U.S. business in its broadest sense. So we're going to talk about policy, and that's probably what most of the people here are interested in, the policy dimensions of businesses' involvement in the region. But let's start with business itself. I mean, when we started this program 10 years ago, I think the premise was that businesses were linking and were integrating across the region, that they were creating supply chains or had created supply chains across the Pacific. A lot of that centered around China, but not all of it. And yet you hear now that there are changes going on in the supply chain story across the Asia Pacific for various reasons, and which changes in China, changes in policy, changes maybe in business priorities or business incentives. So can you give us a sense of how that dynamic has changed and why, if at all? Is that the right premise of the question?
No, that's the right question. Thanks, Matthew. China has been the locus for so much of the supply chain because it's been possible within particular geographies in China to get real economies of scale. So its supply chain has all revolved around, at least touching China. The cost of doing business in China has been increasing for the past few years. So there was already economic pressures to find other places to park your supply chain or parts of your supply chain. In addition, there have been some increasing political risks and other things associated with doing business in China. The Trump administration has kind of put that process on steroids a bit by really trying to pressure businesses to rethink their use of China as a supply chain, in part because of political concerns about China, but also because of a desire to move parts of the supply chain and manufacturing in particular back to the U.S. So we're in this period where we're not sure whether the policy, I know we're not talking about policy, but the policy of the Trump administration is solely focused on moving manufacturing back onshore here, or whether this is a particular China play. And so that's still very much in process now. And I'm not sure where that will end up, but for our companies, the members of the chamber who are thinking about these things, these are all global companies, and the focus of their efforts has been to find the most efficient and productive place to park some of their manufacturing or sourcing, and this has injected a whole new kind of uncertainty into the mix.
Asia is still critical from a U.S. business point of view, both as a market and as a place to produce and invest. That fundamental dynamic is still there.
Yeah, it's there, but it's interesting as companies are starting to think about, well, if we're not going to be sourcing uniquely or building within China, the alternative, yes, Southeast Asia is a particular alternative, but it's not unique. I mean, there is as much a reason to move to Mexico as there is to Vietnam, and arguably there are reasons to move to Estonia as opposed to either of those two. So, I mean, Asia is still very much a focus, but it's not, for U.S. companies in particular, it's not uniquely so.
All right, let me bring Barbara into this as well, because you represent a lot of companies that are members of the chamber, but maybe some that aren't as well. Again, what's the perspective you're seeing on? Forget about, we're going to get to policy for sure with you, but before we get to that, what's the sort of business perspective on supply chains across the Asia Pacific and on the rationale for being engaged in the Asia Pacific broadly?
Thanks, Matt. I think that companies do have a rationale for being in Asia. It is still the fastest growing region in the world. There still are a lot of companies that are seeking to expand business in the Asia Pacific. And I don't think that there's, I agree with Charles that there are some companies that are considering, let's say, moving to Mexico versus someplace in Southeast Asia if they're moving out of China. But I don't think that for a lot of companies that that's a solution, because they do want to remain in Asia and they want to be close to their customers there. I think that there are, however, cross currents of things that concern companies about what's going on with U.S. policy in particular related to Asia that affect decisions. And the first is obviously China and the discussions that we're having in the previous panel about China and U.S.-China friction. I think U.S. companies agree largely with the report that the administration put out, the Section 301 report that the administration put out earlier this year on China. I think that there's widespread support for that and agreement with the articulation of problems that were in that report, but they are nonetheless worried about an escalation in the tension, and most particularly worried that they don't see an end game, no pathway toward resolution of the problem. And the discussion that you were having in the previous panel about decoupling of businesses and supply chains and value chains, I think worries companies because they have invested so much energy and time and resources into developing these supply chains, and separating them out into two kind of parallel universes of business is not something I think businesses find attractive and are quite concerned about the implications. The second thing I think that was also discussed in the last panel that concerns them in terms of the way that business thinks about Asia is, the withdrawal from TPP, aside from the personal pain, was something that I think was not supported by U.S. business. And when you look at how business responded to the decision by the administration, I think at first it was shock and not clear that the administration wouldn't rethink its decision. And every time there's rumors that somebody in the administration is rethinking, I think that there's optimism that the United States might come back to the table, and then the reality that it's probably not going to be the case sets in. So, those companies that, and I think as the majority of companies that want to stay in Asia, are looking at ways that they can take advantage of the CPTPP and remain in the region and use the commitments of the agreement to their benefit through the agreement. They're also looking at the announcement of the US-Japan goods agreement. I think there's a hope that it will expand into something more than a goods agreement. There's certainly lost opportunities from having an agreement that focuses only on goods and isn't more comprehensive, but it is an opportunity for U.S. companies that want to remain engaged in the region, and they will seek to take advantage of that. I think U.S. business is following very closely the discussions of other potential bilateral agreements that the U.S. is looking at. And the other bilateral agreements or EU agreements that have been negotiated that they can also take advantage of. So there are, I think U.S. business remains committed to staying in the region and is looking at all kinds of other opportunities that may be out there if the U.S. is not engaged and doesn't have a more comprehensive strategy for how we intend to play in the region. I would just make one final point. I think that as much as the business community is determined to remain in Asia and sees its interests as competing in the Asia region, the uncertainty that's been created by the policies, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say policy yet, but, and this sort of uncertainty as to whether we're looking at a major paradigm shift in the approach to trade by the U.S. and then therefore other countries that might be brought into it, or whether we're looking at just a couple-year period and then things may revert in some way, maybe not fully, but that kind of uncertainty is really making life very difficult for not just U.S. business, I think, for anybody operating in the region to not be sure whether there's going to be an escalation, are there going to be more tariffs, what are going to be the impact, and how do you plan for the types of things that might potentially come out of the administration. So I think it's a very difficult period. At the same time, businesses know that they're going to have to figure it out and are doing the best they can to hedge against whatever may come.
Yeah, I'm tempted to ask you a policy question to follow up on whether the uncertainty is actually deliberate. Is that the purpose of? I mean, is that what the Trump administration is trying to instill in order to make businesses think again about where they put that next dollar of investment? But think about that, because I'm going to come back to that topic. I want to bring Kristen in, though, to say I do want to talk to you, as we were talking about back there, to talk about the financial risks in the region. But before we do that, can I just ask about, from the perspective of U.S. and other international banks that you represent at IIF, they're there in Asia for a lot of reasons. I mean, they're there to bring capital in, to tap into capital in the region, to serve their clients. business clients, do they still believe in the Asian integration story, and do they still see a big opportunity out in the region as a group, or is there uncertainty and change in their perspective there?
I think both. Yeah, I think there's obviously still vast appreciation that Asia is going to drive global growth. Continues to be about 60% of global growth. But real doubts about whether the Asian export model is sustainable over the long term. And there was a really interesting discussion during the panel Mike so ably moderated a minute ago about kind of this question of U.S. and China decoupling. And one of my thoughts listening to that was that there are lots of things driving decoupling, even apart from Trump administration trade policy, which we're going to discuss in just a minute. Things like the role of automation. So we have basically an export-driven model that was built on labor price differentials. And as companies are investing more in automation, what does that mean for the ability of companies to kind of move the supply chain home? Things like data. There was a really interesting discussion about the different diverging kind of data policies. And as more trade is data-driven, and as we see Chinese in particular, but more broadly kind of Asian regulatory rules around data diverging from rules in the U.S. and particularly in Europe, how are companies going to, will companies be able to continue to do business cross-border? So anyway, I guess that's to say, yes, there's still, a lot of, obviously all of our financial institutions are still incredibly focused on prospects for growth in Asia, but also real nervousness about what the kind of long-term trajectory.
Okay, and since I still have you have the floor, let's talk a bit about financial risk, because the IMF and World Bank have just met in Bali for their annual meetings. And apparently I was not there, and I guess you weren't either, but I know Tim Adams was there, and others who I've heard back from say there's been a lot of buzz about concern about financial risks in the region, particularly surrounding China, but maybe others as well. Is there something we should all, I don't want people to run out here and sell everything, but is there something that we should all be more conscious of than maybe I think we were 6 months ago? Because at the spring meetings here, there was still a sense of kind of giddiness and euphoria about U.S. growth being so strong, global growth still being pretty strong. You get a sense there's been a real change of mood in the last 6 months.
Well, I mean, a lot of the mood in Bali, as reported, was related to some of the sensitivities around trade policy we'll talk about. But one thing that my colleagues at IF have been talking about for quite some time is sort of this difficult choice China's facing between growth and debt. So on the one hand, the Chinese authorities can stimulate the economy with some expansionary policies, which could stem capital outflows. On the other hand, stimulus on the large scale is going to give renewed attention to the debt to GDP ratio, which had stabilized. And obviously, if deterioration in private sector balance sheets could hurt some kind of risk sentiment for China, and so weigh on foreign investor appetite for Chinese bonds or stocks. So they're in this terrible, catch-22. And I should say that a lot of that is not financial. There's a big non-financial corporate side of that. Chinese household debt has increased quite a bit. But financial sector debt broadly has doubled, in EMs has doubled since 2010, and China has seen the biggest increase of that. So financial FX debt has soared from about $110 billion in the first quarter of 2010 to $785 billion in the first quarter of 2018, just to give you some sense of the magnitude of that increase. And a big part of that is cross-border lending. So there was a discussion earlier about the efforts of some countries to push back on what they view as kind of lopsided Chinese official sector loans. But it's worth pointing out that sort of one country's, Malaysia's, debt trap is somebody else's non-performing loan, that that lending is poses some real risk for China too. And so one of the things I think, at IF we're particularly focused on is just debt transparency across the board to emerging markets, and that's debt transparency from private sector lenders, including our members, but also from non-Paris Club official sector lenders, that it creates massive kind of financial stability risks from the fact that a huge amount of lending is unreported, and the IMF and others can't actually assess accurately the sustainability of EM debt across the board. So I think that was some of the gist of the discussion in Bali.
Okay, well, maybe we will come back on that because that's a really important topic. But I do want to come back to trade policy for a couple of rounds here of questions. So, Charles and/or Barbara, to get started, so Charles, maybe with you to ask about Trump trade policy. So characteristically, people are saying that business likes the diagnosis, but they don't like the prescription. So is that fair? They think that there are problems with market access, with overcapacity, with forced technology transfer in China, but they don't think tariffs is the way to solve the problem. Or is that an oversimplification?
No, I think that's a perfect simplification. There have been lots of challenges in China for many years for our businesses, for our members, it's clear from the conversations that our governments have been having that some of those problems just haven't been resolved. So I do think the Trump 301 largely got it right. That these are problems that need to be addressed, but taxing the American consumer and the American businesses probably isn't the way to resolve them. And there are other ways. Probably staying within TPP was a good way of beginning to fight back against these challenges. But I think the reality is that, and particularly if you look at the Made in China 2025 policy, which I think gets a lot of attention, is the challenge for the Trump administration or for any administration in trying to work with China is that you have when China entered the WTO, there was a lot of conversations about, would some of these industrial policies, would state-owned enterprises, would some of the challenges that were identified in the Section 301, would these pose problems for other WTO members and for U.S. businesses? And if you go back to 2000 or so, 2001, and read the Working Party report for China's WTO accession, there's all these questions were raised, and they were raised. What about Chinese industrial policy, and what about SOEs? What about subsidies? And the Chinese representative said, these are all going away. All of these things are going away. We're heading for the market. So, fast forward 17, 18 years, and that's clearly not where we are. And the problem for American businesses or for businesses in general and for any administration is that when you have the fundamental underlying assumption behind the World Trade Organization and the GATT, which is we're trying to remove the ability of governments to interfere in cross-border business activities among private businesses. When you have fundamentally the government in Beijing have such an iron grip on business policy, that fundamentally is in contradiction to everything that the WTO stands for. So, one hates to see what the Trump administration is doing in terms of tariffs and all the rest of it, but one can certainly understand the frustrations of dealing with an economy that really is not compatible with the base assumptions underlying WTO. So I get that.
There was a question in the last panel about whether China is still on the path of reform and opening or has fundamentally reversed its position, and whether that's the source of this problem at the end of the day. because I sense that, and I sometimes say this, that, even if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, we'd be having a lot of these problems. So it's not just about, the Trump approach or tariffs. There's something more fundamental going on here, and it sort of feels like it's China that may have, changed direction in a way more than we have, in a more fundamental sense. Do you buy into that?
Well, we were going to have a more confrontational trade policy regardless of who was in office. A lot of my Chinese friends, they suggest they're surprised by this approach. The administration say, all of a sudden you've changed your tune. Well, I mean, the pot has been on the stove for quite a while, and it just boiled over in 2017. All that said, there are a lot of American businesses still doing very, very well in China. There are businesses that not only say they want to remain in China, but need to remain in China. So part of the frustration is that China really should be going, it should be heading in a direction that it's not. I don't think reform and opening up is dead. I think it's still there. But as your colleague Scott Kennedy says, okay, China, just do it. If China were to follow through on the third plenum reforms from 2014 or 15 and implement those, a lot of the problems that our businesses see would go away. That may not resolve the Trump administration's problems with China and China trade, but in terms of the frustrations that businesses feel, a lot of those would be resolved because that would be in the direction of reform and opening up that is in both China's interest and I think the interest of global businesses.
Gosh, it's so hard to know which direction to take, because I want to ask Kristen about your view of China and what's happening there, and whether the reforms in the financial sector are moving forward. There seems to be some, at least changes in equity, lifting of equity caps and some positive things there. On the other hand, you don't feel a real sense of commitment to a deeper reform and opening of the financial system more broadly. And so, I want to take offline and continue this conversation, then I want to come to Barbara about the trade policy stuff. But
okay. Well, I guess, there's a really interesting dynamic happening, because on the one hand, you see the equity caps lifted, but there's no real rush to go in, especially in the kind of commercial banking side, in part because it's thought to be a kind of overbanked climate anyway. But also one, I guess, hypothesis I have about it is that non-Chinese financial institutions are watching this incredible kind of shift in financial activity within China, away from some of the traditional financial institutions towards Chinese big techs, towards the Alibabas and Tencents. And to me, it's kind of hard. There was a little discussion of that earlier, but it's hard to overstate how dramatic a role these companies are playing in the Chinese economy. One, because they're just so heavily diversified. They're in every sector, finance, they're leading cloud providers. They have close ties to kind of state objectives around city services. So, things like healthcare and transportation. And so they're really occupying this kind of, we call them sort of a new kind of conglomerate. And so and of course, this means that they're acquiring massive amounts of data in a pretty friendly, data-friendly regulatory environment, which means that they know everything. They call it kind of total digital life. That, if you're a Chinese consumer, you can spend most of your day on an Alibaba-related app, and Alibaba is at that time picking up information about kind of everything about your financial life and habits and so on. And so, in a sense, the market access issues are really beside the point, because if China said tomorrow, absolutely no market assets, for commercial finance, no market assets issues, whatever, do whatever you like, in a sense, the environment has just moved so far beyond, because you have these massive companies sitting on, a lot of cash, and more importantly, a lot of data. So anyway, so that strikes me as actually the more, it's going back to this debate about the kind of the debate we had about the role of state-owned enterprises in China, in some ways I just feel like the world has moved beyond that, because there's this new kind of company that isn't subsidized by state capital, it's subsidized by state data, and that's the actual kind of critical thing going forward. But so having filibustered on that, can I say one thing also about Charles's point about your question about companies liking the diagnosis but not liking the solution? That we hear the same concerns, obviously, from our members about the concerns about where the trade skirmish is going and so on. But I've been shocked, and we've been interested by Barbara's view on this, on the degree of actually bipartisan support for a lot of the president's China policies. I mean, when we were in government, and poor Mike had to suffer this more directly, but it always felt like there were sort of two sides of China policy. There were these guys at Treasury who were in charge of economic growth, and they were responsible stakeholder crowd, and they really wanted to, more engagement. And then there were these guys at the Pentagon who were agitated, and Mike had to try to kind of get them around one China policy. And anyway, I've been amazed at the amount of support the Trump administration has received from both sides of the aisle on not just economic policy, but B-52 overflights or freedom of navigation exercises or arms sales to Taiwan, or the whole kind of kit and caboodle of China policy. And it just, despite industry nervousness about it. And so anyway, I wonder if, to me, there actually is a shift in kind of U.S. sentiment.
Well, this is a topic that, we could spend the rest of the event on, and we do a lot of thinking and conversation about that, and we'll have you back for a specific dive into those questions, because it's a really important one. But let me bring Barbara in to ask about, you were the chief negotiator for TPP, and as you said already, I was going to anticipate that it was painful to see us pull away from all that good work on the third day, I guess, of the president's term. And I'm not sure how calculated that decision was, but let me ask a sort of question about whether there was some sort of grand strategy or design in all of that, or at least in trying to create some new dynamic here, where we pull out of TPP, then we go after some of our allies and partners to try and get better deals, and in theory we've improved deals with Korea, with the NAFTA countries, and now we're going to work on Japan, and I'm going to come back and ask about the Japan deal later. But is it possible that there is some sort of pathway here that's being, or set of pathways that is being carved out to get us back to something like TPP in substance, if not in name? And specifically, the NAFTA deal, whatever we're supposed to call it now, the U.S. Air Force deal, or one of the services, I can't remember, includes some of the TPP disciplines on the digital stuff, on SOEs and so forth. So you could sort of imagine that if we start patching these things together, eventually move from a goods agreement to a broader agreement with Japan, you could end up getting a lot of the TPP disciplines back. Do you think that that's the game plan here? Is that what we're trying to do, or is that giving too much credit to the thinkers or planners in the Trump administration?
When the president pulled out of TPP, I think it was his decision that he didn't believe in the value of TPP. I don't think it was, we're pulling out of TPP because I have this other policy that I intend to replace it with, and I've laid it all out very carefully, and as soon as we pull out of TPP, it'll be clear what that policy is. When the president pulled out of TPP, he said he doesn't think regional agreements work. He thought it was a terrible agreement, and he would replace it with a series of bilateral agreements. No discussion of how they would or wouldn't be linked. I think it's fair to see the USMCA as a template for the negotiations.
That's NAFTA 2.0.
Sorry? NAFTA. Revised NAFTA, the USMCA, as the template for negotiations with Japan and other countries around the region. And if you do a compare, right, which I have done, of TPP and NAFTA, you'll see it's actually quite similar, surprisingly. shockingly, across the agreement. There are changes in some areas and there are additions in some areas, but it's actually quite similar. So I think on those areas like SOEs, like digital economy, and some of the areas that people focused on TPP, there are some differences, but they're largely the same as TPP. And I think you could see those as the model for where the administration is going in terms of bilateral negotiations. I think it's important when you have this conversation not to allow yourself the temptation of saying, well, they could have done this and stayed in TPP and then built off of TPP, and you would be X number of years ahead of yourself because they pulled out. So this is where we are, and this is where we're starting from, and you can't live your life as though we were still in TPP. We're not. And so the administration...
Sounds like you've been counseling yourself.
Yeah, I'm
telling yourself this for therapy.
I'm in therapy. But, you know, the administration did a quick little markup of Korea, so we're done with that. It didn't include any of these kinds of provisions that we're talking about here. It will go into the negotiations with Japan looking at the template from USMCA and then look to build out from there. The question is, well, there are two questions that emerge in my mind from this. One is, which other countries in the region are interested in negotiating with the United States, having watched the manner in which we have negotiated with Canada and Mexico? How many countries are there that want to put themselves in the position of negotiating a trade agreement with the United States where the main goal is to eliminate the trade deficit with the United States? If that is the goal, not balanced trade, but actual to move production into the United States, I think that's something that would be a questionable premise for a lot of countries to start negotiations with us, and I don't think you've seen many countries lining up to ask to negotiate with the United States. So I think that's one problem with this approach. The second problem is when we moved in 2008, when we first launched TPP, from a bilateral approach to a regional approach, there was a reason we did that. And the reason, there were many reasons we did that, but among the reasons that we did that was because a regional agreement allows for a common set of rules across the region and for all of the supply chains to grow out of that agreement. Now we're going to have individual bilateral agreements at a moment in time when TPP comes into force, RCEP may come into force, the EU is looking to negotiate around the region and has a plan for how it's going to link the agreements, and we're going to have isolated individual bilateral agreements with some very important trading partners, potentially, if we do Japan, but without any broader vision of where we're seeking to take this. And I think that's the part that raises concerns.
Okay, I want to ask about the extension of these efforts in TPP to other agreements, and especially the Japan one. But before I do that, Charles, from a business perspective, is there some logic in doing this stuff bilaterally? I mean, is it better, worse, neutral? And, you know, I guess in a way, as compared with a bunch of regional agreements that are not overlap, I mean, there's a spaghetti bowl of different regional possibilities here. From a business perspective, it's very hard to plan in any case. Does it really matter whether we do this bilaterally, multilaterally, regionally, in the WTO, somewhere else?
I mean, from a business perspective, I'm not sure there is. I think one of the things that we certainly found when we were at all of us when we were in government, that getting one agreement through Congress is just as hard as getting a broader agreement. So there is, I think, politically some advantages to doing regional agreements, even setting aside the fact that it's you know, you're removing at least a number of the strands of spaghetti from the bowl. But you know, I understand the logic from the perspective of a New York real estate developer of the benefits of negotiating bilaterally with suppliers and all the rest. I mean, there is some kind of there is some advantage to being the world's largest economy when you go into a bilateral agreement versus a multilateral agreement, and to the extent that you're concerned about loss of sovereignty in the process of creating these kinds of trade agreements, you're certainly in a better position when you're negotiating bilaterally. I'm not sure that you get the best agreement as far as businesses go, to the extent that that you're looking, as most businesses are, most global businesses, for efficiency primarily, and the ability to move where the price and the ease of doing business makes the most sense. When you are, as clearly was in the case of the Korea Agreement and the USMCA, and arguably other agreements that they're talking about, injecting notions of managed trade with a specific design of moving or keeping parts of the manufacturing base in the United States, that's where businesses get a little bit tetchy. That's not what we look at when we're thinking about creating free trade agreements.
Okay. In the last panel, there was talk about new members of, well, several of these arrangements, but CPTPP in particular. We talked about the possibility of other Southeast Asian countries joining, and then the big question of whether China ultimately would, should, or could join CPTPP. First of all, just predictively, we don't have clickers, but if you were voting, would you predict that China was going to be in CPT, in 1 year, in 5 years, in 20 years, or never? Which of those seems most likely, and what would the reasons be, and for doing that, and what would that mean for regional integration? Either Barbara or any of you. But Charles. Start.
I think we'll conclude the FTAP before China gets into the CPTPP.
Oh, does that sound right? Meaning never, right? Okay. Barbara, do you have thoughts on, or just more broadly, the expansion of CPT? Where next for CPTPP?
I do think other countries are likely to join in the near term, and the countries that are in CPTPP are talking to a number of countries about joining. So I do expect to see expansion fairly rapidly. I don't see China as being a country that would be joining in the near term. There are a lot of commitments, some of which were discussed in the last panel, that I think would be difficult for China to take on at this point. And having spent a lot of time developing those kinds of commitments and thinking about the implications, I think the countries that are in the agreement would want to ensure that they've maintained that standard, and any country that joined that agreement would be able to live up to those commitments. So I would expect it to take time.
If I asked another clicker question, I might have asked it a different way, which is, which is more likely to happen faster? China joining CPTPP or RCEP with India in it being concluded, and I'm not sure which of those would happen first either. But another area of inquiry that I'm not going to be able to get to. I'm going to ask about the U.S.-Japan deal in an interesting way in a second, but one more question before I get to that, and then I'm going to turn to the audience, which is, we haven't mentioned APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum that we are participants in. The President is not going this year. Vice President Pence will go to Papua New Guinea, I guess, or to a ship off Papua New Guinea. I'm not sure if he's actually going to set foot in Papua New Guinea. I don't know. APEC, and I'm going to bring Kristen into this by saying that APEC has a finance minister's process and has actually done some productive work over the years in trying to promote both domestic financial reform and liberalization and integration across the region, whether in reference to APEC, because you may not have studied that brief in detail to prepare for today, and so don't know what is on the agenda today. I don't myself. If you do, that's great. But just in more general terms, is there an opportunity here for financial integration across the region that APEC or other forums could promote?
Yeah, that has been a sort of big focus of IF. There was a at our Bali meeting, there was a really interesting discussion led by this kind of eminent persons group on some of the benefits of financial integration. But obviously, there are enormous obstacles. One of them is these differing regulatory approaches. There's the some of the things about sort of distrust, particularly of some of the Chinese institutions and other things. So anyway, I'd expect that to be a continued focus. But
okay. Any other thoughts on APEC before I ask about the U.S.-Japan FTA, which is going to be my last question to everybody? Anybody? Did you do APEC at some point? Do you think APEC is still relevant in the regional economic integration story? I talked to our ambassador, Matt Matthews, to APEC the other day, and he said, the U.S. is still pushing for all the kinds of things that you would expect us to push for in APEC, from trade and investment, liberalization, services, women's empowerment, a whole bunch of good things. That seems useful, but is it really relevant in the...
APEC, I think, has always been relevant in the sense that it's an incubator for ideas and sharing of different initiatives across the region. I think as a negotiating forum, it was never intended as a negotiating forum, and if you ever try to negotiate something there, the first thing somebody will raise their hand and say is, this is not a negotiating forum. So I think that in terms of the role that it can play in some of these difficult issues that we have been discussing here today, especially in the area of the digital economy, where there's been lots and lots of discussion in many different fora, but APEC is one of them. It's a very useful place to surface ideas and try to get a consensus on a way forward. I mean, it's a difficult group because of the countries that are in APEC. The 21 economies have different perspectives on lots of different issues, including the digital economy. But it is an important area to have those discussions so that you can surface the differences, resolve them, try to come up with a consensus, and then carry that over to negotiations. So I think it's still relevant, and I think it's still an important discussion group, but not some. I don't think that as a negotiating group or the hope that the FTAP will ever evolve out of these discussions that go on in APEC is something that we're looking to APEC for.
Yeah, I'm told that actually China, which is the champion of FTAP now, in theory, has been really kind of dragging its feet and not wanting to really move forward on the work plan, and so it's just another indication of how challenging that's going to be. But again, we could do a whole, and we usually do a whole conference on APEC. Actually, this year we're not, unfortunately, but I think it's an important little forum, so I wanted to make sure we covered that. Okay, let me ask about U.S.-Japan in this way. For now, it's a trade in goods, at least according to the Japanese. I think maybe USTR has a more expansive view of this, so that's what I want to ask about. If this U.S.-Japan deal turns out to be something like an FTA with rules as well as the market access pieces, it seems that we've talked in the last panel about the poison pill that was in the NAFTA deal, of the possibility that you could withdraw if one of the members negotiated with a deal with a non-market economy, which everybody understands to mean China. That's one possible poison pill for Japan in this story if we insisted on that in a U.S.-Japan FTA, it seems to me. But there are two others, one of which you alluded to, Barbara, which is the domestic content, the rules of origin about production, in Japan's case of automobiles and primarily. If there was if the Trump administration insisted on substantially higher American content in Toyotas and Nissans and so forth, as the price of access to this market, how do you think Japan's going to respond to that, and what difference would that make? And then the final thing that I took note of in the new NAFTA was the provision on which I think is Article 33, which is the provision on currency, on foreign exchange issues, which was different from TPP in that there were similarities in that a lot of it was done in a sort of a side agreement about what the basic provisions or disciplines would be on manipulation. But in the Canada deal, there's an actual binding obligation to, at a minimum, be transparent about your foreign exchange intervention, and that could be subject to dispute settlement. So at least a piece of the currency deal seems to be subject to dispute settlement, which is different from TPP, which was where it was outside the agreement and not subject to that. So that strikes me as a former Treasury guy in Tokyo who knows the finance ministry's view on currency provisions in trade agreements as a potential poison pill as well, from Japan's point of view. So throwing all that together, any views down the table on the prospects for a U.S.-Japan agreement, particularly with those things in mind?
Let me talk about the 3 poison pills you raised, or potential poison pills. On the provision that was in NAFTA that says, there has to be consultations on non-market economy and you can pull out. There are some who say that this is not that significant, that there's a withdrawal provision in trade agreements anyway, and this is just an elaboration on that. There's also nullification and impairment clause. If the actions another party has taken have nullified and impaired the benefits that you negotiated, you can take them to dispute settlement. So there's some people arguing that, and the parties themselves in particular. I think that the provision is problematic and would be problematic for Japan, if I could speak for Japan, but I'm not. I should let somebody from the Japanese government speak to this. It is problematic, I think, in 2 ways. One is that it's a provision that sort of forces countries to choose sides. It's a us versus them kind of a provision. Either you're with us or you're against us. And to put that in a trade agreement, I think, is very difficult to accept for an Asian country that's in the neighborhood, and something that it's hard to see how Japan could accept it as written in the CPTPP. The second concern is sort of more precedential about the inclusion of a commitment like that. So in this agreement, we say, we're going to allow one party to make the other party explain what's in the agreement, and you can renegotiate if you don't like what was negotiated. Aside from the sovereignty questions, which are real and legitimate. What happens the next time when a trading partner says, well, we're going to put this same provision in, but it applies to if you don't, if you don't join the JCPOA, or you don't join the climate change treaty, or you could imagine this extending to all kinds of other social or political issues that carry over and conflate our political issues with our trade agreements and allow trade agreements to have to carry a whole lot more weight than they already carry, and that is already very difficult to manage. So I think that as a precedential issue, it's a little disturbing. On the rules of origin, it's hard to imagine that rules of origin don't say more production or more domestic content in the United States. They say in the parties. So I don't think that necessarily, that kind of language would necessarily be problematic for Japan if you raised the domestic content, as long as it was US or Japan. I can't speak for the companies as to whether that would be specifically problematic, but I expect it probably would be something manageable. The issue that's more difficult, I think, is the managed trade thing that Charles raised before, and if that sort of a commitment was imposed, either some kind of quota or production requirements or something like that. On currency, I'll let others speak, but I'll just say I think that the commitment that was made in this in the USMCA is actually not different than what was in TPP, except for the fact that it has now been brought into the agreement and subject to dispute settlement rather than being a separate negotiated agreement not subject to dispute settlement. And the commitments that are subject to dispute settlement are transparency commitments. So in my mind, The dam,
which has not been an issue with Japan, really,
which has not
ever,
been an issue
as
with,
opposed to sometimes there have been questions about the actual manipulation, but not about the transition.
So I don't,
That's not subject
right.
to this.
So I don't expect that Japan would actually have a problem with that. I think there are other questions that arise from the way we've approached it, but in terms of negotiations with Japan, I don't see that as being a problem.
I'm not so sure, but I appreciate the view. Okay.
I thought just quickly, I mean, in addition, I thought Barbara made really persuasive points that some of the poison pills may not be as poisonous as we think. But the other thing is that Japan would have to view all this in light of, at the same time as they're making an assessment on how seriously they take the threat of auto tariffs under 232, because of course one of the key elements in the new NAFTA was this side letter basically providing some binding commitment that the U.S. won't apply 232 auto tariffs to the parties. And if you make an assessment, as I do, that the president really likes 232 as a trade tool and is going to be going back to it a lot and really likes it as leverage, getting told you're off the hook on that actually is a pretty big concession. And even if you think, okay, President Trump's not going to be in office forever, it's possible that just the frequency of his use of it is going to make even the next president think, hey, this is a pretty handy tool. And there's no sign that Congress is sort of acting to kind of limit it. So anyway, so I think that may make the Japanese kind of think about the benefits differently.
Okay. All right, Charles?
I think those are all excellent points. The one thing I'll say just on 232, even in the Korean context, the revised chorus context, the 232s have not been pulled off the table. So if I'm Japan and I'm approaching this goods agreement or whatever either side wants to make it, I want the 232s off the table before I come at the outset.
And there's obviously, at least in public, there's some ambiguity about whether that, that has been, what the status of that is going in to the talks. Okay, again, I have about 15 other lines of questioning that I want to pursue with these folks, but we don't have a lot of time, and I do want to give some time to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone and identify yourself, and if you can, direct a question to someone. Yes, sir. This gentleman in the front here. We've got a crowd, so it's hard to get through. There we go.
Thank you for great discussions. I'm Naoatsu Aoyama from the Asahi Shimbun Japan's newspaper. I have two questions on China. My first question concerns the strategic goal of the United States in the current U.S.-China trade dispute. From the Japanese, I think that U.S. key allies like European Union or Japan largely share the goal of encouraging China to change its unfair trade practices. But from the Japanese perspective, I think the question is really what would be good enough for the U.S. to acknowledge China's efforts to change its behavior, to better its behavior. If the U.S. So the problems creating the market distortion, China's structural problems creating the market distortions is really are not really problems that are easy to solve quickly. So if the U.S. goal is to contain China instead of just reducing its trade deficits with China, the trade tensions, the economic tensions surrounding the Asia-Pacific region will really drag on. We have to brace for the economic, very long-term tensions. So could any of you comment on that? That would be this is the first question. And my second question is about, yes, sorry. The second question is about the trade, the implications of this, what they call the trade coalition of the willing for Japan-U.S. relations. Some of the key advisors like Mr. Kudlow say the trade coalition of the willing is really to confront China, whereas Secretary Mnuchin said in a press conference in Bali last week, he clearly said that the trade coalition of the willing is not to pressure China. So what we should think, what do you think about this?
Okay, well, U.S.-China trade, and I guess the basic question is, what does the Trump administration want? What's it going to be satisfied with in this story?
It's a Freudian question. I think that's an excellent question. None of us know, and I think if you're Beijing, that's the question you really want to know, and it's unclear. I think the Trump administration's views are coalescing around a Lighthiserian view rather than some of the others in the mix. But I don't think that we've settled on what would be satisfactory for the Trump administration. As far as the coalition of the trade coalition of the willing, I'm not sure it exists except in fantasy yet. But I think at some point, if there is a group of like-minded countries that are viewing the distortive effects of economies like China, that it necessarily has to be directed at finding some means to either encourage Chinese trade practices to change or to quarantine practices that are distortive in nature.
Yeah, sure.
And the first question, I think maybe the most interesting question in U.S. foreign policy today is sort of what does the U.S. want out of China? Particularly, there was lots of discussion after the vice president's speech in early October, where there was kind of a long litany of U.S. grievances. So everything from the trade practices and IP to, militarization of the South China Sea and so on. Human rights and religious liberties, and we published a piece that sort of compared this era in U.S. foreign policy to 1946. And the basic gist of it was that in 1946 there was sort of U.S. Growing appreciation of the Soviet threat. So there was a sort of pretty broad spread agreement about what the list of concerns was, but there wasn't a sense of what the U.S. strategy or kind of prioritization was until George Kennan wrote the long telegram and basically eventually published as an article and focused U.S. policy around, okay, we're focused on containment, that basically we're going to stop the growth of communism. And I feel like we're at this period where there's, as I said, bipartisan consensus about a list of concerns, but nobody has actually articulated, okay, what we want out of it is a change in Chinese trade practices, or no, what we actually want to do is decouple our economies so we can compete with China more directly. I mean, we're at this kind of pre-strategy phase, if you can call it that.
Yeah, I was going to say, let alone a strategy to get there. Apart from, so what we want and how to get there has not been really clearly articulated yet. I was just going to say on the coalition of the willing that the I think it was alluded to in both panels, or at least the last one, about this U.S., Japan, EU grouping of trade ministers that's produced now 4 statements, basically one a quarter over the last year, to cover things like subsidies and overcapacity and forced technology transfer, digital rules, and WTO reform. Looks, interesting and promising, and I think there's some interesting content in there, and I certainly think it's something worth watching. The other thing is next week Canada is hosting a kind of Committee to Save the World event that the EU and Japan are going to be at, but pointedly the United States and China are not invited to talk about, as I understand it, WTO reform and the broader system issues. So there are things going on that are trying to address these issues, which either side, U.S. or Japan, is involved in, or both. Yeah, Barbara.
I just wanted to add, I agree with what my colleague said. I think that the question about U.S.-China that makes it really hard to answer is that at the beginning we were fighting a trade war. And then it became clear, like with the Pence speech, that we're not fighting a trade war, we're fighting a much broader set of issues. And we've conflated all of the military, security, political issues with the economic issue, and they're all one big package of things that we're dissatisfied about now. And so in terms of how we resolve it, are we looking for a set of proposals that address specific economic issues, or are we looking to address a much broader set of things, and how do we go about doing that? It may be that when President Trump and Xi meet at the G20, that they agree on some kind of economic package, and we kind of fixed a little piece of it, but we still have this broader set of grievances. But I think even if we do that, the broader set of grievances remains there, and there's going to be a lot of friction between us going forward.
Okay. I'm going to maybe take a couple of questions, and then we may have to wrap up. So that gentleman there, is there somebody from this part of the room? Okay, the gentleman back in the corner there.
Thank you all so much for speaking today. My name is Tobin. I'm currently with the SEC Office of International Affairs. And also thank you to CSIS and JETRO for hosting the event. I've heard arguments about who's going to win a trade war if it continues to escalate, largely framed as who has more ability to flexibly respond to the trade war, be it adjusting global supply chains for accessible labor or affordable labor, or whether or not China can find other consumer markets with which they can trade. From the perspectives of the global supply chains that you all diversely represent, which side do you really see this coming down on? Do you think that the US can find other labor affordably, or do you think China is truly limited or less limited in their ability to find consumers?
Okay, who has leverage? And this gentleman in the back.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Anshu, inside U.S. Trade. My first question, also on the China front, I'm curious how you think that companies are kind of navigating this environment, because as you've said, that it's kind of unclear what the U.S. goals are. So if this is kind of a short-term phenomenon where China will buy some soybeans and LNG and we'll all go home, why would I go through the exercise of moving my supply chains? On the other hand, if this is a broader strategic disengagement, maybe I should get out of China. So how are companies navigating this? And then on the currency side, Matt, maybe you can just kind of defend your position, because the point that Barbara raised, I've also heard that basically this USMCA was only enforceable with regards to the transparency requirements, and the monetary easing that Japan has been doing wouldn't be actionable. So thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I think broadly, who has the leverage here, and how does this affect U.S. or Chinese kind of involvement in the global supply chain story, I guess is a question, and how are companies navigating, Charles? Either of those, or if you want to take on the currency one.
I don't want to take on the currency one. I learned years ago to leave that to Treasury. In terms of how companies are managing it, I'll put a plug in for the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore, which has done a pretty simple but fairly pointed survey of members, saying how are you looking at the supply chain from the perspective of our members. It's all over the map. You have companies that said, hey, we've sunk so much capex in China, we're stuck producing there, and we'll have to either eat the cost or pass it on. And then you've got companies that are sourcing that have said, hey, we were under pressure already, and we're moving sourcing to Vietnam or to Mexico or wherever it is. So it's really all over the map. In terms of who will win, we're all winners. I think that's the wrong question. Yeah, look, if you look at trade as a percentage of U.S. GDP, we can take a fair amount of pain. And probably more pain from that perspective than China, but that doesn't mean that gets you to a place where you're better off than you were before. And I think, if the goal of the Trump administration is to force cataclysmic change to China's economic structure, that ain't going to happen. So I'm not sure that there's a victory on that front. If the goal is to move pieces of the supply chain either to other markets or to the United States, I think there are reasons that was going to happen anyway. I'm not sure that that's a big victory for American labor particularly, but certainly, I can see companies thinking, all right, well, if I'm forced to choose where I'm going to put my next dollar of investment in production, I think the Trump administration has made the United States a little less politically risky than other markets.
I was just going to say that that it's obviously it's not just labor costs that, labor costs are rising in China, and there are places where companies can find cheaper labor, like Vietnam. But if you think of the supply chain as kind of a spider where all the, points of production go into some final point of manufacturing, you don't want any of the spider's legs to be too long, so you need roads or some form of transportation to all of them. You want the spider's head close to some final consumer, and so there are all these, Charles knows this world much better than I do, but there are all these kind of complicated factors that go into, what's sort of an attractive point of production. And so anyway, so I just say that to me, the IMF has said that if all the channels of the trade war are put into play, we go to the final 267 billion and the Chinese retaliate with whatever they want to come back with, that the impacts on GDP will hit China more, I think sort of 1.6 points of GDP versus a little bit less in the US. But I think Charles hit on the point that it's not the actual numbers, it's your political tolerance for the numbers that really matter. And we've had Chinese officials say to us, we have very high paid tolerance. At a recent meeting, one Chinese official said, we slept on the ground during the Cultural Revolution. Americans aren't going to sleep on the ground. And I think there's a point to that obviously democratic systems are sensitive to political pressure. On the other hand, I've been really surprised, as I said, by the bipartisan support, even though some key Republican constituencies are on the receiving end of retaliation. So, so it may be that actually, pain tolerance under the Trump administration is higher than it might be normally.
I'll just add on the pain tolerance thing. I think it's important to keep in mind that the tariffs that went into effect were 10% until January 1st, and the question is when they go to 25, and if the last tranche goes into force, if the tariffs go into force on the last 267 or whatever the real number is, I think that the tolerance may reach its limits. So I think we just may not have let the story play out just yet.
Plus, there's the retaliation from China that causes its own pain, which, especially for farmers who have definitely felt this pain, and as they go into the winter season and try and get bank loans, if they don't have markets to sell into next year, they could find it hard to get loans and stay in business. So it's causing real pain. On the other hand, they seem to be tolerating, at least the China part. Now that NAFTA is resolved, it feels like maybe they'll suck it up and take a little more China pain because they want the president to succeed in this. We'll see. On currency, just very quickly, I think that's correct that Japan materially, it's not a lot of skin off their nose to agree to something like this. But just from what I know of the Japanese finance ministry, I think as a matter of principle, it's going to be very hard for them to accept binding disciplines in a trade agreement on currency-related matters. That's just my prediction. Okay. We don't have time for more questions. Unfortunately, our luncheon speaker is here. I think I'm supposed to say that lunch is served out on the Samnun Terrace, so you can get your lunch and chew it briefly, and then we're going to come back here. You can bring it back here into the room and eat it here, and then we'll have our luncheon speaker, Julie Chung from the State Department, shortly. So please join me in thanking the panel for a terrific presentation. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
I apologize for interrupting your lunch. We're going to thank you all. Thank you all very much. This is a very disciplined crowd. No spaghetti bowl. One set of rules. So we're going to wrap up our very interesting discussion today by hearing from a senior official from the administration, and I'm delighted that person will be Julie Chung, the Director of the Office of Japanese Affairs in the State Department, a position she's held since August of 2017. Julie really represents the very best of the Foreign Service and really the best of the United States and countries across Asia, where I have bumped into her again and again throughout my own career. She's currently holds the rank of Minister Counselor, but she's held various positions dealing with economic security and politics around the region. In 2002, we were in Pyongyang for negotiations, and Julie was our core North Korea expert from the State Department. After, I think it was 3 very tough days of negotiating, we were going crazy, so Julie asked me if I wanted to go for a jog in Pyongyang. So I said, sure. So at about 6:30 in the morning, we came down, and Julie was wearing her, she's from LA, so she had all her, I think it was LA Lakers bling. We had just come from South Korea, so I had a US Army t-shirt. And she said, follow me. And so it was my first time in Pyongyang. And we ran into the streets of Pyongyang, and 2 guys with heavy weapons and suits on kind of gave up trying to follow us. And we had a nice, I don't know, 2-3 kilometer jog through downtown Pyongyang. So Julie knew exactly where she was the entire time. I was imagining the rescue operations, the CNN interviews I would give afterwards, describing life in a North Korean prison. I bumped into her again a few years later in Hanoi, where she was a public affairs officer. And then 2 summers ago, my family and I were in Phnom Penh, where she was the chargé d'affaires. And in every one of those, Julie demonstrated a remarkable ability to marry strategic purpose and deep, deep insights on the ground, which is exactly what you want in your very best diplomats. So Julie's agreed to talk to us about the U.S.-Japan relationship right now, including our new agreement, and how the U.S. and Japan can cooperate together in Asia. So please join me in welcoming Julie Chung.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for that nice introduction. I think that's the best memory I've had with Mike, is that jogging through Pyongyang and trying to escape the bodyguards at that period. But since then, as Mike has said, we've run into each other in a lot of places. So thank you. Thank you to CSIS for hosting me here so warmly with all of you, and our friends at JETRO, of course, for co-sponsoring this very important event on Asian economic integration. It's been a busy time for U.S. diplomacy, I've got to say, in the Indo-Pacific. It hasn't been boring. The U.S.-Japan alliance continues to be the cornerstone of peace and stability in the region. Our level of engagement with Japan has never been higher and central to our ever-growing cooperation, and we reflect that in our shared interests and values as we advance the free and open Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific represents, as you know, more than half the global population and the global economy. So as a Pacific nation, the United States is deeply invested in the region's continued peace and prosperity. Trade between the U.S. and the Indo-Pacific nations totaled about $1.8 trillion last year, and the U.S. is a major investor and donor in the region, of course, as well. Our Indo-Pacific strategy, which you've heard a lot about in recent months, seeks to expand on this strong record of partnership that has engendered relationships built on trust and contributed to advancing prosperity and security across the region. The U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific is, in Secretary Pompeo's words, a whole-of-government mission with U.S. business engagement at the center. So I was glad to see a lot of the private sector representatives here. Our objectives are to spur greater private sector investment and provide more opportunities for greater economic collaboration with our partners. And we're pursuing multiple avenues of economic engagement to advance this vision. First, we're working with regional partners to improve the rules of trade and remove impediments that limit opportunities for greater investment in the Indo-Pacific markets. We're also working actively with the EU and Japan to maintain market-oriented conditions that are fundamental to a fair, mutually advantaged global trading system. And I heard Matt in the previous session, I was watching online, talk about that in the US-Japan-EU relationship. Second, we are committed to supporting U.S. businesses as they export and invest throughout the region through initiatives like the Commerce Department's Trade Winds Indo-Pacific. Third, and very significantly, the President just signed the BUILD Act into law on October 5th. The BUILD Act more than doubles U.S. development finance capacity to $60 billion under a new development finance institution. The U.S. will now be able to make equity investments, providing more opportunities to invest with our partners. This is an enormous opportunity to bring more private sector investment into the Indo-Pacific. It's an important step also in demonstrating U.S. commitment to fostering high standards in infrastructure development and providing strong alternatives to state-directed initiatives that often come with hidden strings attached. Fourth, at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum in July, Secretary Pompeo launched 3 initiatives that will spur greater commercial engagement in the digital economy, energy, and infrastructure sectors. The Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership will establish public-private partnerships to build digital infrastructure, deploy technical assistance to improve partner countries' regulatory policies, fund programs to help partners improve cybersecurity, and expand opportunities for U.S. technology exports. We will also invest in greater energy access and security across the region through Asia Edge, the Enhancing Development and Growth Through Energy. This will expand public-private partnerships, foster business-to-business connections, and deploy technical assistance to partner governments. Example projects include providing technical assistance to improve partner countries' regulatory environments, procurement processes, working with partners to develop national, regional energy market plans, using development finance to encourage deployment of private capital, and helping countries develop smart grids and other forms of modern energy infrastructure. Finally, Secretary Pompeo also launched the U.S. Infrastructure Transaction and Assistance Network, or we call ITAN, that will help ensure that infrastructure built in the Indo-Pacific region is physically secure, financially viable, and socially responsible. To that end, the U.S. established this new interagency body that led by the National Economic Council to coordinate U.S. government tools and promote sustainable infrastructure development across the region. A new Indo-Pacific Transaction Advisory Fund will also help partner countries access private legal support and other expertise during complex project negotiations. So this kind of far-reaching vision, of course, cannot be carried out unilaterally. And from where I sit from the Japan office at the State Department, I strongly believe Japan is our integral partner, is our premier partner in this endeavor. And our cooperation with Japan in the Indo-Pacific has tracked closely with all of the priorities that I've laid out. In the digital economy arena, we're focused on the next frontier of wireless technologies, such as 5G, as well as next-generation data analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning that will provide access to an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet, what our Japanese call Society 5.0. Cyberspace will be increasingly an engine of economic growth and innovation in the Indo-Pacific, and the U.S. and Japan offer partners the support they need to foster a vibrant and resilient digital economy and ensure a secure cyber future. For example, just last month in Tokyo, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, METI, conducted joint training on cybersecurity of industrial control systems for ASEAN member and other Indo-Pacific partner countries. And we hope to make this a continuing endeavor. The centerpiece of bilateral cooperation in the energy sector is the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, JUSEP, announced in the fall of 2017. We share a view that open and competitive energy markets are indispensable to securing energy supplies, and that access to affordable and reliable energy resources is essential to eradicating poverty, fueling economic growth, and increasing global security. Now, one major focus of this partnership is energy infrastructure development in the developing world that promotes regional integration. And it also adheres to principles of good governance, respects the interests of all stakeholders, and expands access to global energy markets, and is marked by transparency in both bidding and financing. Already, USTDA, the Trade and Development Agency, is working with Japanese counterparts to support the development of high-quality, energy-related infrastructure throughout the Indo-Pacific. Earlier this month, USTDA and METI trained officials from Southeast Asia on incorporating liquefied natural gas into their national energy mix. Meanwhile, the State Department and other U.S. government agencies are working in a coordinated fashion with our Japanese counterparts to identify additional cooperative activities. Last but not least, the physical infrastructure is a critical piece of the Indo-Pacific strategy that also reflect our shared values and our shared interests. We must tackle the massive need for infrastructure in the region. But for infrastructure to help transform economies, it must also be conceived and constructed in accordance with internationally accepted standards and financed through transparent and sustainable terms. To this end, both the U.S. and Japan recognize that the private sector's expertise and resources are the most important factor in ensuring the delivery of quality, best value infrastructure at the pace the region requires to sustain its economic growth. We have had promising developments on this front. In April this year, the State Department hosted a vibrant day-long roundtable on bilateral infrastructure cooperation in third countries that drew strong private sector interest across many companies and areas. The event not only helped the private sector learn about American and Japanese efforts to cooperate in infrastructure, including financial support available from both governments, but also provided a forum for the private sector to share their views on opportunities and challenges they face in the infrastructure investment arena. I previously mentioned the BUILD Act, but even before the BUILD Act was passed, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, has been working closely with its Japanese counterparts, the Japan Bank for International Cooperation and Nippon Export and Investment Insurance, to identify financing opportunities that promote quality, best value infrastructure projects and boost economic growth. In addition, this summer at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum, the U.S. and Japan announced a trilateral partnership with Australia to invest in infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific region that addresses key development challenges, increase connectivity, promote economic growth, while working to attract more private capital to achieve greater results. At this point, it's important to note the principles that undergird the United States development work as articulated by USAID Administrator Green in his speech at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum. He said the first is that the purpose of our foreign assistance must be ending its need to exist in order to promote each country's desire for self-reliance and ability to be independent. The second principle is our belief that private enterprise is the single most powerful force for lifting lives, strengthening communities, and accelerating that self-reliance. These principles are evident in the way we engage with our partner governments. To accelerate their progress towards self-reliance, we are prioritizing programs that incentivize reforms, strengthen in-country capacity, remove barriers to private investment, and help those countries mobilize their own domestic resources. Our approach stands in direct contrast to others. We don't use so-called debt diplomacy to expand our influence. We support aid that requires due diligence to evaluate project viability and isn't financed through opaque, unsustainable loan terms. Sri Lanka is just one example of many to be saddled with this kind of crippling debt. We will seek to provide foreign nations with a transparent, sustainable, and high-quality alternative to debt trap diplomacy. Lastly, I would like to touch on the relationship between the U.S. and Japan. As I mentioned at the beginning, our alliance is the cornerstone of peace and security in the region. We say this in every speech, in every event, and in every meeting, and it remains true. Our nations are bound together by our shared values of democracy, human rights, free markets, and our cooperation with Japan spans a broad range of political, economic, and security areas in Asia. The administration's strong relationship with Japanese leaders underscores our deep partnership with Japan. President Trump has met Prime Minister Abe more often than any other world leader. Keeps us busy at the Japan desk. And Vice President Pence and Secretary Pompeo have had many meetings with the Deputy Prime Minister Aso and Foreign Minister Kono, respectively. Most recently, President Trump and Prime Minister Abe met at the UN General Assembly and decided to begin negotiations for a U.S.-Japan trade agreement. This is an important step towards achieving more balanced trade with Japan. In 2017, the U.S. had a $68.9 billion trade deficit in goods with Japan, our third largest after China and Mexico. We want to increase U.S. exports to Japan while at the same time welcoming Japanese direct investment into the United States, which now exceeds $476 billion. It is also estimated that Japanese affiliated firms directly employ more than 856,000 people in the United States as of August 2017. Our military equipment sales to Japan will also continue to rise to unprecedented levels this year. The current value of Japan's outstanding requests for U.S. foreign military sales are valued at more than $20 billion. In fact, just in September, Congress approved a Northrop Grumman E-2D Hawkeye sale to Japan, estimated at $3.135 billion, and aiming to improve our interoperability, which is so important to us. So to conclude, our alliance has been resilient. It continues to be strong through decades of peace and prosperity at home and abroad. And as we further look to the Indo-Pacific and look at how our shared values and shared interests and shared goals will continue to expand that peace and security for the region, I am more confident and more optimistic than ever that the U.S.-Japan alliance will remain forever strong and remain a great partnership as a template for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. That was really a perfect capstone for the discussion we had today, because we spent much of the morning talking about the mega agreements and negotiations like RCEP and CPTPP, and you gave us a really illuminating view of the many, many other areas in energy and economics, trade and finance where we're working with Japan every day. You'll take a few questions? Okay, I'm going to ask two, and Matt's next right of refusal if you want. First of all, during the discussion a little bit today, but also in the media, you hear some speculation that Prime Minister Abe is going to meet with Xi Jinping in 10 days, in part because of uncertainty about the Trump administration's trade policy. And Chairman Ishige this morning suggested perhaps Japan will be in the position to broker or resolve the U.S.-China trade war. With that as background, I'm interested in your view of Prime Minister Abe's meeting with Xi Jinping in 10 days. And second, we're in a think tank, we need an acronym. Can we now call this agreement the USJTA? Is that the official name, U.S.-Japan Trade Agreement? And without the G at the end, which you often hear on the Japanese side, does it mean this is more than just an agreement in goods, or is that yet to be worked out between the parties?
As for the Prime Minister's visit to China later this month, I think Japan-China relations have been improving within the past few years, and we welcome that. We all want a constructive relationship with China, including Japan. So I think the Prime Minister has been working very hard to develop those kinds of relationships in the political and the security and economic and trade fields. And we understand that that would encompass a multitude of discussions across all those broad range areas. I have not heard about Japan being a mediator between U.S.-Japan issues. I think we deal with countries bilaterally on whatever concerns that we have on trade or investment. But certainly Japan and the U.S. share many of these values that I've talked about, whether it's at the WTO or at APEC, a lot of issues that on trade that involves intellectual property, forced technology transfers, subsidies, many of the things that you discussed this morning as well, state-owned enterprises. So we do share many of those economic pillars that you see in thriving economies. And so if Prime Minister Abe has those discussions with his counterpart in China, we welcome those discussions, of course. Now on the trade agreement, and you all saw the joint statement at the margins of the UN General Assembly that the Prime Minister and the President agreed upon. And it is a U.S.-Japan trade agreement on goods as well as other key areas, including services. Now, if you try to put that into an acronym, I try to write it out. It's TAGOSIOSIS or something. It's quite long, so I can understand why the confusion and why some people may want to shorten it to call it a TAG or trade agreement on goods. It is not exclusive to goods. It does include services, and it will include discussions on trade and investment issues as well. And it includes discussions actually on practices by third countries, that the very things that we talked about and the various distortions that we talked about. So again, it is wide-ranging. I think sometimes it is simplified in the media, and I think we just want to make sure that if you read the complete joint statement, that'll outline what this will encompass. And we have still yet to know what all the negotiating terms will be, because it has to go through the notification process here with Congress and the 90-day clock, and all that has to proceed in full consultations with stakeholders in the private sector and within our government. So it's to be decided on the exact terms of the agenda and what that will mean. But in terms of your question, whether it is limited to goods or not, it will go much beyond goods.
Thank you. The floor is open. We have microphones if people would like to ask questions of Julie Chung. Matt? Yep.
Okay. I didn't want to monopolize, and if others want to ask, please do. But Julie, that was great. And it's interesting, when we started this series, it was mostly about, these events, it was mostly about trade. Now infrastructure looms much larger, and you mentioned infrastructure. I didn't count, but at least half a dozen times. So it's obviously a key part of the way you think about our relationship with Japan today, which I assume is, frankly, prompted by China's activity here with Belt and Road and so forth. And I just wonder whether the challenge is actually finding good projects that good projects that are bankable and that can actually be produced and developed and financed. And then B, how do you actually get, U.S. and Japanese companies together and get the financial support? Because like JBIC's mission is to promote Japanese companies. This new IFDC is mostly going to be aimed at promoting U.S. business interests. As a practical matter, how do you get those agencies and the companies to work together to actually come in and bring what the U.S. and Japan bring to this story, which is great, products and services and capacity and rule of law and all the good things that we bring to this infrastructure story. It's just the practical stuff is tough.
No, you're right. It's our joint efforts with Japan on infrastructure is based on the fundamental things that we share, we want to see in the region, and we want to be helpful in the region to provide every option and alternative that countries have, so they're not limited to one option. Now, in terms of matchmaking, I think that's kind of what you were looking at. How do we get the companies together practically? And that's a good question, because we don't direct our companies. We don't order companies, go invest in this and this project. That's not the way the United States does business. So in terms of, that's how we look at it in terms of matchmaking. We have done several events out in the region. We'll continue to do that. We had an event last fall in Singapore. We'll do some events in the Philippines, again, throughout the region, where we're trying to matchmake and bring together the right companies, again, for them to figure out what works best for them. And these financial terms and packages that through OPIC and the BUILD Act, these are to help facilitate that, but we're not going to do the work for the companies themselves. The companies have to decide what's bankable, again, what's in our interest, what makes sense, and working with the local government and local leadership to find out what that is. And I know that many countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, have their own infrastructure 5-year plans. How does that fit in? And how does that fit in into the regional makeup? When we want to support ASEAN centrality, we want to really support ASEAN's ability to build and strengthen and uphold its own infrastructure projects and other projects involving energy and digital economy and connectivity. But all these can be done, we believe, primarily through the private sector, not by the U.S. giving handouts. And Japan believes that too. So again, we're trying to do that matchmaking at every opportunity.
Time for one more question. Ishige-san, you also get a first right of refusal if...
Since Michael Green referred to my name, so I'm forced to say something. But the one thing that I have to be clear is that Japan can play a bridging role in the future. I said, we are not in a position to intervene in this process quickly. In the future, if we are requested to do so, maybe we would be able to play as a third party to bridge the gap between the United States and China. And at the same time, I refer to the trilateral trade ministers meeting. And I said at an appropriate time, the three trade ministers can invite China to one of the meetings. Again, at an appropriate time, not soon. So we must be careful at the timing. This is a very, very delicate stage, so we have to be careful about that. So please don't misunderstand my message in the statement that I made this morning. That's what I wanted to say this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We always welcome Japan to play bridging roles with us and other countries, other like-minded countries and other countries in the region where we can expand our cooperation. So thank you.
So Julie, thank you very much. We've had a really interesting discussion. On balance, probably a little more optimistic than pessimistic. You helped us ramp up over the hump to the optimistic side. Thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing for the State Department, but also and especially for the U.S.-Japan relationship. Let me also thank Matt Goodman and the Simon Chair team and the Japan Chair, especially Nick Saint-Cheney, who leads this effort, and Ishige-san and our colleagues from JETRO. And thank you all of you. Join me in thanking Julie Chung for helping us bring this to a good close.